Chapter 97. When the marching music sounded, the long-awaited military parade finally began. When a group of soldiers slowly appeared in front of the camera, the little fellow finally saw what she liked to see. So, she jumped out of Chun-Shi's arms again. She ran to the steps of the West Wing, raised her head and stuck out her chest, waved her arms and kicked her legs, trying to imitate the handsome appearance of soldiers. The little fellow's little face was tense, and she wanted to pretend to be serious. But her cute little appearance still made Chun-Shi laugh. There were only the father and daughter in the big yard, but it didn't seem empty at all, because it was full of their laughter. The little fellow was playing happily, but at this time, Chun-Shi's phone rang. He took out his mobile phone and found that it was not a call, but a video call from Aunt Zhang. Seeing this, Chun-Shi immediately connected the video call, and then waved to the little fellow. "Hey, you little brat. Don't you know how to send a text message to me during the festival? Do you have to let me take the initiative to greet you?" As soon as the video call was connected, Chun-Shi was about to greet Aunt Zhang, but what greeted him was Aunt Zhang's teasing. Seeing this, Chun-Shi immediately raised his hands and surrendered. He quickly pointed the camera at the little fellow and used her as a shield. "Grandma, Grandma, I miss you so much." As soon as the little fellow saw that it was Aunt Zhang on the other side of the video, she immediately waved her little hand wildly at the camera. Looking at her excited and happy appearance, Aunt Zhang really fell into the trap. Therefore, she didn't have time to complain about Chun-Shi anymore. Instead, she smiled and said, "Oh, my good granddaughter, Grandma misses you too. When are you going to let Dad bring you to Rong City to play again?" Hearing this, the little fellow immediately turned to look at Chun-Shi and asked, "Papa, when are we going to see Grandma? I miss Grandma." After hearing their conversation, Chun-Shi couldn't help laughing. How long had it been since they came back from Chengdu? Aunt Zhang was still blaming him for wasting money last time, but he didn't expect that she would take the initiative to let them go this time. It seemed that Aunt Zhang couldn't leave the little fellow. Thinking of this, Chun-Shi held the little fellow in his arms and said to her, "Come, Nian Nian, let me say a few words to Grandma." The little fellow nodded obediently, and Chun-Shi pointed the camera at himself. After greeting Auntie Zhang, he said mysteriously, "Auntie Zhang, take a look. Where is this?" While talking, Chun-Shi slowly turned the camera. After slowly scanning the courtyard with the camera, he turned the camera back to himself. "Hey, this is Sai Courtyard? Have you found Ying?" Auntie Zhang had lived in this place for 10 years, so she was very familiar with it. Therefore, she immediately asked excitedly, "Where's Ying?" "Let me see that girl." Chun-Shi shook his head helplessly and sighed. "We haven't seen her yet. Maybe it was a bad time. When we came, there was no one at home, so I just brought Nian Nian here and planned to wait for her here." "You haven't seen her?" After hearing this, Aunt Zhang couldn't help but change her expression. In fact, she really hoped that Chun-Shi could find Ying. After all, she had been with Chun-Shi for a while, and she recognized Chun-Shi very much. She didn't tell Chun-Shi where Ying's house was because she wasn't familiar with Chun-Shi and wasn't sure what kind of person he was. On the other hand, she promised Ying that she wouldn't tell Chun-Shi. She didn't reveal any information, but Chun-Shi still found her, so she couldn't be blamed. Therefore, Aunt Zhang's first reaction was to be happy for them. However, she didn't expect Chun-Shi to still not see Ying. Where did that child go? Was she still angry with Mr. Qin? Aunt Zhang was lost in her thoughts as she thought about it. Chun-Shi waited for a while, but Aunt Zhang didn't say anything. After hesitating for a while, he asked carefully, "Aunt Zhang, do you know Qin Yongyan?" "Huh?" Aunt Zhang was stunned. She didn't seem to hear him clearly. Seeing this, Chun-Shi could only raise his voice and ask again, "I mean, you know Qin Yongyan, right?" "Of course I know him. Mr. Qin is Ying's father." Hearing this, Chun-Shi was a little excited. Just as he was about to say something, Aunt Zhang couldn't help but let out a long sigh. She asked with a complicated expression, "Ying hasn't told you about her family, right?" "No. Every time I asked, she was a little unhappy, so I didn't dare to ask too much." "Sigh, so that's how it is." Hearing this, Aunt Zhang immediately let out a long sigh, then slowly sighed and said, "Since you've already found her house, then I'll tell you." "Okay." Hearing Auntie Zhang's words, Chunxi immediately sat up in excitement. Aunt Zhang was finally willing to tell him about Yingying's family. How could he not be excited? When Auntie Zhang saw his reaction, she smiled in relief. After thinking for a while, she slowly spoke. I remember the first time I met Yingying. She was only 8 years old. She's actually quite pitiful. Her mother passed away early, so Mr. Qin asked me to take care of her. As for me, I've been a nanny for 10 whole years, not counting this little one. Aunt Zhang smiled and pointed at the little one in Chunxi's arms. Then she continued. Yingying is different from other children. She's been very sensible and independent since she was young. She doesn't cry, throw tantrums, or cling to people. I basically only need to cook for her every day. I don't have to worry about her life too much. Mr. Qin is also quite an easygoing person, so this nanny job is quite easy and enjoyable. Unfortunately, good times don't last long. When Yingying was 13, Mr. Qin was transferred to work abroad, so he couldn't be with her every day. Think about it, a 13-year-old girl who lost her mother when she was young and her father wasn't by her side every day. How pitiful is that? At that time, I often asked her why she didn't live abroad with Mr. Qin. Speaking of which, that girl was also strange. She would rather be separated from her father than go abroad. She always said that it was better here, but she didn't want to leave. There were only 3 of us in this house. Mr. Qin didn't lack money and didn't rent out the more than 10 empty rooms. So when he was transferred, the house became much quieter. In the years after that, it was just the 2 of us living in the compound you're living in now. Mr. Qin would only come back during the holidays, and every time, he would come and go in a hurry. In a flash, 10 years have passed. I watched Yingying go to primary school, middle school, and high school. I was even the one who attended the parent-teacher conference for her. When she graduated from high school, Mr. Qin was finally transferred back to China. At that time, my mission was completed, so I planned to go back to Chengdu. You don't know, but on the day I left, that girl insisted on sending me to the airport. She cried so hard. I've lived with her for so many years, but I've never seen her cry like that. Sigh. At this point, Aunt Zhang's eyes also turned red. She couldn't help but cry. She was still writing at 3 in the morning. Happy Christmas Eve. Chapter 98. Perhaps it was because she was reminded of the days she spent with Yingying, but Aunt Zhang couldn't help but cry. From when Yingying was 8 years old to when she was 18, Aunt Zhang took care of her for 10 whole years. How many decades did one have in life? 4 years in college, 2 years after graduation, and then Chunxi's disappearance and her pregnancy. In a flash, another 10 years had passed. How many decades did one have left in life? Chunxi had long noticed that something was wrong with Aunt Zhang's mood, so before Aunt Zhang cried, he coaxed the little girl to watch TV. The little girl couldn't bear to see others cry. If she saw her grandmother crying, she would probably cry immediately. Chunxi held the phone and didn't speak. After a long while, after Aunt Zhang's emotions gradually calmed down, Chunxi asked, Aunt Zhang, does Yingying have any relatives? Yes, she seems to have quite a lot of relatives, but they're not in Shangjing. I have to go home during the holidays, so I haven't seen her relatives much. Does she have any siblings? There should be a few. I've seen Yingying's younger sister, who is her second uncle's daughter. She only came once. But that girl isn't close to Yingying. When she came, she was cold to Yingying, as if someone owed her money. I don't like that girl. Younger sister? What's her name? I'm not familiar with that girl, and it's been more than 10 years. How can I remember? Okay. Chunxi nodded helplessly. He wanted to ask more about Yingying, but at this time, Aunt Zhang's granddaughter suddenly cried. Chunxi had no choice but to reluctantly say goodbye to Aunt Zhang. Shangjing was in the north. Therefore, after the National Day, the weather would gradually turn cold, and the temperature difference between day and night would increase. The father and daughter naturally occupied this mansion, with a market value of hundreds of millions. Every afternoon after dinner, Chunxi would take the little girl to stroll around Shikahai. Gradually, many neighbors got to know them. It had been a long time since anyone had lived in this courtyard house. Therefore, in the beginning, some of the neighbors who still remembered Aunt Zhang and Yingying would always look at Chunxi and his daughter suspiciously. As long as they did anything unusual, they would not hesitate to call the police. Let the outsiders see that other than the CY district in Shangjing, there was also the XC district. However, the little fellow didn't care about the strange gazes of others at all. Every time someone asked, more or less trying to test whether they were old deadbeats who had taken over someone else's house, she would proudly puff out her chest and say loudly, "This is my mommy's house. Therefore this is my home." At this time people would ask, "Where's your mother?" This was a very complicated question. Therefore, every time she heard this question, she would always be like a frosted eggplant, weakly stammering, "My mama went abroad and hasn't returned yet." This was what Chen-shi had told her. Her father wouldn't lie to her, so as long as they stayed here, her mother would definitely come back. She really wanted to see her mother, just like how Chen-shi also wanted to see Ying. However, as time passed day by day, Chen-shi's heart sank day by day. Every day, Feng Mintai would pretend to pay a visit to him. Although he said it was a visit, he was actually worried that Chen-shi had already found the person he wanted, so he would renege on the debt and not pay. A clue was worth 1 million, but if Chen-shi found the person he wanted to see in this house, then the 1 million would become 10 million. After all, he was the one who found the clue to this house. However, with his punctual visits every day, Feng Mintai gradually realized that the 10 million might not be so easy to earn. Helplessly, the project was restarted. This time they focused on Qin Yongyan. This was the only clue that could be developed again. In the purple world, the wisps of smoke stopped cold, and the rain passed through the clouds. Envied the peach leaves, the curved sill in front of the window, the swallow's nest, and the willow's vermilion door. Looking back at the first year, the misty hair fluttered in the wind, and the delicate spring. In the welcome place, only the youthful beauty was affectionate, and the jade pendant was attentive. Who knew that at this moment the ecstasy, vaguely smiling in front of people, remembering the slender palm, it really became a dream. The resentment and memory of the flower should be a double literature, carrying the mood of wine, teaching the beauty poetry, regretting in vain that the romantic has wronged people. Who should go, waiting to send the hatred, the two places equally. On October 10th, the first snow fell in the Mentugu mountain area. However, it could not be considered the first snow in Shangjing. The so-called first snow was strictly regulated. Only when more than 10 of the 20 man-made stations in Shangjing observed the phenomenon of snow, or when all 5 stations in the city, Chaoyang, Haidian, Fengtai, Shijingshan, and Observatory, observed the phenomenon of snow, or when 3 or more of the 5 stations in the city observed the phenomenon of snow, and at least one station had snowfall. Only when the snow was 0.1 millimeter could it be considered the first snow. Winter was getting closer and closer, and the locust trees in the courtyard finally lost all their leaves. They held up the graceful branches of the withered trees, as if they were welcoming the coming winter. The little fellow went out less and less often. There was only one thing she liked now, and that was to hide in the warm room with the electric heater, wrapped in a quilt, and watch TV with the big cat. Shangjing was dry and cold, and Zhonghai was wet and cold. Although the temperature in Zhonghai was higher in winter, it was windy and humid. The most important thing was that there was no heating. The house in the Kongju district did not even have air conditioning, let alone heating, so the little fellow had always been afraid of winter. She did not expect that after coming to Shangjing, the electric heater in the courtyard house would make her fall in love with this winter. Chen-shi stood in the courtyard in a daze for longer and longer. His temper was also getting worse and worse. Of course, for the little fellow, Chen-shi still doted on her as usual. But for anyone other than the little fellow, Chen-shi could only laugh. Including the big cat. Although Chen-shi did not scare it much, the big cat now took the initiative to avoid Chen-shi when it saw him. Unless the little fellow held it, it did not dare to get within 5 meters of Chen-shi. Even Big Cat received this kind of treatment, not to mention the incomparably treacherous Feng Mintai. However, Feng Mintai was also a master of changing the rudder according to the wind. Since the last time he was kicked out of the courtyard by Chen-shi, every time he came back he would not cross the Chuehua gate again. This was because he had a vague feeling that something was about to happen. If he provoked Chen-shi again, his life might be in danger. Ning Zhonghua and Su Wei did not dare to call Chen-shi now. although the influence of the energy cultivation pill had declined to the lowest point under their joint efforts. But some fires were easy to light. It was difficult to destroy them. So after a lot of hesitation and consideration, Ning Zhonghua had to summon up the courage to carefully call Qin Shi. However, Qin Shi only responded with one word. Get out. After hanging up the phone, Ning Zhonghua looked at Su Wei helplessly. Su Wei was a little confused. That was a boss above the ministerial level. Would Mr. Qin refuse? Ning Zhonghua shook his head and did not speak. Su Wei was so anxious that he scratched his ears and cheeks, wishing that he was the one who called just now. Ning Zhonghua patted him on the shoulder silently, motioned for him to calm down, and then walked to the window. After exhaling deeply, he could not help but sigh. A storm is coming. Wind building. It was getting colder and colder. November 21st. The little fellow received the biggest gift besides her father. New snow. When she woke up that night, Shangjing City had completely changed. The first snow of this year came earlier than before. When the little girl crawled out of Nuanyuan's bed, she found that the courtyard had completely changed. It was like being painted with white paint, and the whole courtyard was dyed white. Wrapped in silver, it was exceptionally enchanting. She put on her small cotton-padded jacket, and did not wait for Qin Shi to wash her face. She had already rushed out of the room and ran to the courtyard, shouting crazily. Chapter 99. When it snows, Shangjing becomes Beiping. When we go to Hohai to see the snow, we return to the Ming and Qing dynasties. This was what the poet Yin Lichuan wrote on her blog after she went to Hohai 1 year after the snow. The plain words were enough to move many people. That year, the snow in Shangjing was very thick. As far as the eye could see, the roads and roofs were flat, which also covered a lot of the modern atmosphere. Especially in Hohai, there were very few things that were obviously modern, and there were many old houses. The heavy snow covered all the hustle and bustle of modern society. Standing in the snow, it was enough to make people feel like they were in the Ming and Qing dynasties. Shangjing was covered with snow, and the palaces were all silver. This year's first snow had been falling for an exceptionally long time. Since last night, the snowflakes had not stopped falling. It was estimated that this year would also be a year of heavy snow. It rarely snowed in Zhonghai. Poor southern children, who had lived so long, had never even seen snow. The heavy snow completely ignited the little girl's childish nature. If it wasn't for the fact that the snow wasn't too thick, she would have been rolling around on the ground. The reason why the little girl was so excited was that she had never seen snow. Johns Hopkins University. The Johns Hopkins researchers at the Johns Hopkins University published a recent research report in the journal Science that when children are faced with novel and unexpected things, they will learn more than when they are faced with ordinary things, and it will make them smarter. If it was an ordinary parent, they might have already grabbed her back to wash up, eat, and do what they should do. But Qin Shi didn't. He put the towel back in the basin, then went to the steps outside the west wing, quietly watching the little girl squatting on the ground and trying to rub a snowball. At the bottom of the steps, the snow had condensed into ice. The little girl scraped up the snow layer by layer, then put it in her hands and rubbed it into a ball. The snow was not too thick, so she rubbed it very slowly. And she didn't wear gloves. When she finally rubbed out an egg-sized snowball, her pink fingers were already red from the cold. Papa! Snowball! Snowball! The little girl ran to Qin Shi with the snowball as if it were a treasure. As if she didn't notice that the snowball was so cold that her hands hurt. Qin Shi squatted down and gently stroked her little face that was flushed with excitement. He said softly, "Be good, throw it away. We'll wash up and eat breakfast after you throw it out. Then Daddy will make a snowman with you, okay?" "Okay." The little guy nodded heavily. Then he turned around and raised his hand to the back of his head. Then he threw it out with great force. Seeing the snowballs scattered all over the ground, the little fellow immediately clapped her hands happily. Qin Shi gently held her hand and asked with concern, "Are you cold?" "Not cold." It was so cold that his bones hurt, but the little guy still laughed and shook his head. Qin Shi didn't point it out. After wrapping her little hand in his true essence, he picked her up and said, "Let's go. Daddy will take you to wash your face, eat, and make a snowman." Make a snowman. Make a snowman. With the temptation of a snowman, the little girl immediately followed Chun-Shi to wash up. After breakfast, before Chun-Shi cleared the table, she couldn't wait to take Chun-Shi to the yard. There was not much snow on the ground, so Chun-Shi slowly raised his hands in the little girl's slightly excited cry. A gust of wind suddenly blew in the small yard. That year, the first snow in Shangjing was particularly heavy. At the entrance of Dongming Alley, a Spencer slowly came to a stop. From the outside, this car was somewhat similar to a Jinbei car, except that it had a Mercedes-Benz logo. There was only one woman sitting in the big car. She was holding a glass of red wine and shaking it slightly. After the car stopped, the woman lifted the curtain and looked inside. After confirming that she had arrived at the station, she lowered the partition between the car and the driver's seat, and then asked, "Old Meng, when did they live here?" "It should be September 29th. You told me not to get close to here, so I'm not very sure about the specific time." September 29th. The woman gently put the wine glass on the table in front of her, and then laughed softly. She seemed to be talking to herself and said softly, "Today is November 21st. Do they really think of this as their own home?" After that, she opened the door and got out of the car. The woman was very tall, and she was wearing a Canada coat, goose beige coat, and a pair of black Balenciaga boots. Looking at her dress, she looked like a model who came to the old street for a photo shoot. It was still snowing, and the stalls on the old street were not open today. After all, it was better to stay at home in this cold weather. The bluestone road of the old street was covered with snow, and the sound of the woman's footsteps echoed in the empty alley. A few minutes later, the woman came to the door of the courtyard. She didn't hesitate and directly pushed the door open. Chun-Shi and the little girl were squatting in the middle of the yard, making a snowman. He had already noticed the movement in the alley, so he stopped what he was doing. Therefore, when the woman pushed the door open and entered, Chun-Shi also stood up. One was in front of the screen wall in the southeast corner, and the other was in the middle of the yard in front of the main hall. The two of them glanced at each other. However, the tall courtyard wall blocked their view. Chun-Shi stood still. The little girl was busy adding bricks and tiles to the snowman, so she didn't notice Chun-Shi's strange behavior. The woman moved. Tap, tap, tap. Her heels stepped on the stone floor, making a crisp sound. Every time the sound rang, it was like a morning bell, beating Chun-Shi's chest fiercely. He stared blankly at the drooping flower gate that separated the inner and outer courtyards. The woman walked steadily, and soon crossed the front yard and came to the drooping flower gate. And at this moment, Chun-Shi also saw her face clearly. She wasn't Ying. An indescribable feeling immediately surged in Chun-Shi's heart. He stared blankly as the woman walked straight towards him. The little girl squatted on the ground, holding a ball of snow with both hands, and was about to slap it on the snowman. The woman was getting closer and closer, and her footsteps finally startled the little girl. The little girl turned her head and glanced at the woman who suddenly appeared. Then, she suddenly grinned, as if she was very happy, and asked sweetly, "Sister, do you want to make a snowman with us?" The woman didn't speak. The little girl waited for a while. Seeing that she did not speak, he no longer paid attention to her, and continued to build his own snowman, huffing and puffing. The woman silently looked at the little girl squatting on the ground. After a long while, she suddenly asked, "What's her name?" Her voice sounded very cold. Just like today's weather, although the sun was bright, there were still snowflakes floating. Chun-Shi was stunned for a moment, then solemnly replied, "Chun-Yan." "What about you?" "Chun-Shi." "Chun-Shi?" After softly repeating this name, the woman finally shifted her gaze from the little girl to Chun-Shi. "My name is Qin Xuecheng. Asterisk 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 asterisk. Thank you, brother, Xiaozhongyu, for the 20,000 reward. I have to apologize to you here. It's not that I don't want to add more, it's because I really can't write that much. It's not that I'm not working hard, I've really done my best. I've been racking my brains every day to write. Please forgive me. Sincerely, this book's reader group, 511793123. Chapter 100. My name is Qin Xuecheng. Her voice was as bright as the sun today, but her tone was as cold as the fluttering snowflakes. The snowflakes drifted into the necks of the passers-by. It was cold and people couldn't help but shiver. They had no choice but to pull their clothes closer. Qin Xueqing. His surname was also Qin. Upon closer inspection, her appearance actually bore some resemblance to Yingying. However, the cold aura she exuded was worlds apart from Yingying's. If they had met on the road, perhaps even Chunxi wouldn't have been able to recognize her. This woman with a cold expression in front of him was actually Yingying's sister. Auntie Zhang had said that Yingying had a younger sister, who was her second uncle's daughter. If he was not mistaken, it was the woman in front of him. After hearing the woman's self-introduction, Chunxi, who had been a little hesitant, immediately stepped forward and said very politely, "Hello, hello." As he spoke, Chunxi extended his right hand to her. To be honest, this was the first time he had encountered such a situation in his hundreds of years of life. She was his sister-in-law, after all. There was an old saying in Shangjing, "The sister-in-law is half of the brother-in-law's ass." It meant that it would be a waste not to feel pain, and it would be a waste not to touch it. In fact, it was all caused by the traditional feudal thinking of the past. It was easier to get familiar with people. Even if they were discovered, his mother-in-law would turn a blind eye to it. After all, they used to be very particular about not airing their dirty linen in public. Chunxi didn't have such disgusting thoughts. He was just a little nervous because it was his first time meeting Yingying's relatives. Yes, nervous. He was afraid that he would leave a bad first impression on this woman named Qin Xueqing. This had nothing to do with status, strength, or cultivation. Instead, it was directly related to Yingying's position in his heart. As the saying goes, love a house, love its crow. Chunxi loved Yingying very much, so naturally, he would show enough kindness to her family. However, what Chunxi didn't expect was, this was the first time the two of them had met. However, Qin Xueqing seemed to hold a certain degree of hostility towards him. "Do you see the words outside? This is the Qin clan. You can leave." Her tone was very calm, as if she was just narrating a very simple matter. Hearing this, Chunxi looked at her with some surprise. After being stunned for a moment, Chunxi gently shook his head and withdrew his right hand that was expressing goodwill. "I'm waiting for Yingying. Once I see her, I'll leave. She won't come." Qin Xueqing glanced at Chunxi and then looked at the little fellow again. However, when she saw the little fellow's silly look, she didn't like him. Instead, a trace of imperceptible disgust flashed through her eyes. "If I were you, I would take the child and go as far away as possible now." "Why?" Chunxi seemed to be a little puzzled. Qin Xueqing didn't answer immediately. She just looked at the little fellow silently, as if she was seriously thinking about something. After a long period of silence, she looked at Chunxi again and said calmly, "Because you don't deserve it." "I don't deserve it." As if he had heard a big joke, Chunxi suddenly couldn't help laughing. He shook his head and chuckled involuntarily. "You mean that your family is very particular about matching in social status, right?" Qin Xueqing was silent. Chunxi pointed to the main hall behind him and asked with a smile, "It's the 70th anniversary of the founding of the People's Republic. Why, the Great Revolution didn't sweep away your stubborn feudal ideas." Hearing this, Qin Xueqing's expression, which had never changed since ancient times, finally relaxed a little. She sighed softly. With some doubts, she said softly as if she was talking to herself, "I really don't understand what my sister is thinking. She actually gave birth to a daughter for you." The smile on Chunxi's face disappeared. This was because Zhao Yuan had once said something similar. If only Qin Xueqing wasn't his sister-in-law. Chunxi really didn't expect that his first meeting with his sister-in-law would end up like this. The atmosphere in the yard suddenly dropped to the freezing point. However, Qin Xueqing obviously didn't care about Chunxi's feelings. After thinking for a while, she sighed softly with a kind of almost pity in her eyes. "Well, I'll tell you why." After that, Qin Xueqing raised her delicate hand. Her fingers were very beautiful, white and slender and without impurities, as perfect as cold jade. Then she shook her 5 fingers gently. An invisible force shot out in an instant and hit the snowman in front of the little fellow. Bang! The snowman collapsed in an instant, turning into countless pieces of snow that drifted in all directions. She flicked her 5 fingers and hit the snowman 10 feet away. The sudden turn of events stunned the little fellow. She was holding a ball of ice and was about to hit the snowman's head with the ice in her hand. But in the blink of an eye, the snowman disappeared. The snowman that she had worked hard to build for a long time had turned into countless pieces and completely disappeared in front of her eyes. The little fellow looked down at the original position of the snowman. There was only a thick layer of snow left there. "Papa." The little fellow squatted on the ground and held the ice. She looked up at Chun-Shi in confusion. Her eyes were full of doubts. Where did the snowman go? She looked down at the original position of the snowman again, until she was sure that the snowman was really gone. Then with a wah sound he suddenly burst into tears. In fact, Chun-Shi could have stopped Qin Xueqing's behavior. But he didn't. Because of this woman's actions, he suddenly had a kind of enlightenment. However, it was precisely because of his carelessness that the little fellow began to wail in grief. So, Chun-Shi quickly squatted down and gently held the little fellow in his arms. The little fellow cried sadly. As soon as Chun-Shi stretched out his hand, she rushed directly into Chun-Shi's arms, and then tightly hugged his neck. She pursed her lips and cried loudly, "Papa, the snowman is gone! The snowman is gone!" "Good girl, Nian Nian, don't cry. Papa will show you a magic trick, okay?" However, the only response he got was the little fellow's loud cries full of energy. Chun-Shi stopped talking and slowly stood up with her in his arms. The little fellow cried on Chun-Shi's shoulder. Her pitiful appearance was really pitiful. Chun-Shi gently patted her head and comforted her with a few words. Then he turned his head and calmly said to Qin Xueqing, "You scared my daughter." This time, it was Qin Xueqing's turn to be stunned. "You know what? If you weren't Yingying's sister, you would have died 10,000 times by now. I want to reason with you, but you have to talk to me about strength. Then I'll show you what strength is." As soon as he finished speaking, the wind and snow all over the sky suddenly became stronger. Then a tornado strangely blew in the yard. All the snowflakes above the yard were rolled into the wind column. The originally invisible wind column seemed to have become a large white funnel at this moment. And the center of the funnel was where the snowman was just now. Chun-Shi stood beside the snowman, holding the little fellow in his left hand and slowly stretched out his right hand. Countless snowflakes continued to fall on the snow pile under the guidance of the wind. Then, the snowman slowly condensed into a shape at a speed visible to the naked eye, and then became bigger and bigger. What was happening in front of her eyes was completely beyond Qin Xueqing's imagination. She stared at the man holding the child in a daze and stepped back a few steps in fear. The snowman was growing taller and taller. In just a few breaths, it had become a super large snowman more than 3 meters tall. This also made Qin Xueqing's beautiful eyes almost pop out. What was happening in front of her eyes could not be done by human strength. Thinking of this, she could not help but ask with a trembling voice, Who are you?" "Me." Hearing this, Chun-Shi chuckled softly. Chapter 101. In the Sihiyuan. The sudden gust of wind finally subsided. The heavy snowfall was actually not a good sign. As the saying goes, timely snow indicates a bumper year. Only a moderate amount of snow could be called timely snow. A moderate amount of snow could not only kill insects and keep warm, but also provide water for crops, and would not crush the crops. This was the sign of a bumper year. The snow stopped. The little fellow stared blankly at the huge snowman in front of her. The scene that unfolded before her eyes had completely stunned her. She opened her mouth involuntarily. Even if she did not cry again, her little nose was twitching unconsciously. She didn't even need Chun-Shi to coax her. She had already completely forgotten about crying. "Papa, this snowman is so big." The little girl raised her little head slightly. Her shocked expression immediately made Chun-Shi unable to help but smile. Seeing her adorable appearance, Chun-Shi's mood couldn't help but improve a lot. "Mua." After kissing the little fellow's face heavily, Chun-Shi looked at her and asked softly, "What do you think? Do you like this snowman?" Yes. Chun-Shi's question made the little fellow come to her senses. Therefore, she immediately sat in his arms and began to dance. "Papa, put me down." I want to play with the snowman. Chunshi quickly put her down. As soon as she stepped on the ground, the little fellow threw herself into the snowman's arms. The snowman wouldn't carry her, so she plunged her small body into the snow. The falling snow kept falling on the little fellow's head, and some even fell into her clothes. Although she was shivering because of the cold, she enjoyed it and giggled against the snowman. Looking at how excited she was probably about to bury her head in a pile of snow. Chunshi put down the little fellow, and then turned to look at Qin Xueqing. At this time, Qin Xueqing had also come to her senses. She originally thought that Chunshi was just an ordinary person, but she didn't expect that Chunshi was actually a necromancer. Furthermore, with the means that Chunshi had just displayed, his realm might have even reached the level of cultivation above the Dao entry realm. Han Fizi, human leader. Moreover, the cultivators of magic are incompatible with the ministers of the path. How do you explain this? If the master has a warlock, then the high minister will not be able to make a decision, and the high minister will not dare to sell the high minister. If the high minister controls the power and influence, then the way of the master will be clear. Records of the Grand Historian, Huainan's Hengshan biographies. In the past, Qin Ju followed the path of the saint and killed the sorcerers. He burned the book and book, abandoning etiquette and righteousness and relying on deceit. He accepted the punishment and turned the millet of the sea into the West River. Han Wangfu's treatise on the hidden husband, virtuous men's difficulty. Those who are weak in virtue will have a bad impression of good deeds. Those who are in political turmoil will have a bad impression of governance. This is the reason why the Qin dynasty killed Yu and trapped the warlocks. Necromancers were necromancers, also known as warlocks. They were adept at worshipping ghosts and gods, concocting pills to achieve longevity, and were even known as spellcasters. For example, the hermit expert who allowed Ning Zhonghua to live for more than 50 years was most likely a necromancer. The necromancer lineage had a long history, but now, it had almost disappeared from the world. Even the legends about necromancers were pitifully few. Most of the remaining branches of the necromancer lineage lived in seclusion deep in the mountains, maintaining the ancient tradition of passing down one lineage to a single person. The culprit behind the decline of the necromancer lineage was actually the first emperor in the history of Huaxia, Qin Shi Huang. Qin Shi Huang burned books and buried Confucians. This was a very cruel history. There were many historical records about this, and the historians of the past dynasties also had many discussions about it. However, the strange thing was that all kinds of books had detailed records of the burning of books, but the records of the burying of Confucians were very vague. In fact, this was because Qin Shi Huang did not kill Confucian scholars at all, but necromancers. The reason why Qin Shi Huang wanted to kill necromancers and swear to cut off the inheritance of necromancers was very simple. Back then, necromancer Su Fu was ordered by Qin Shi Huang to lead 3,000 boys and girls to the East Sea to search for the legendary Penglai, Fangzong, and Yingzhou Immortal Mountains to find the elixir of immortality. However, after Su Fu left, there was no news of him, and he never returned to Huaxia. Qin Shi Huang, who realized that he had been deceived, was furious and vented his anger on the necromancer lineage. He hatefully killed countless necromancers, causing the necromancer lineage to almost be cut off. After the Eastern Han Dynasty, it was already a long time ago from the Qin Dynasty. The public opinion of the Qin Dynasty, as well as the status of the Confucian school at that time, and the popularity of the modern literature school, distorted the facts and completely twisted the story of Qin Shi Huang deceiving necromancers into Qin Shi Huang deceiving Confucians. To put it bluntly, Qin Shi Huang was framed, which was why he was cursed by the Confucian school for more than 1,000 years. As for whether this was revenge on Qin Shi Huang by the remnants of the necromancers, no one knew. After all, history had long turned to dust. With a flip of his hand, he could create clouds and rain with a flip of his hand. This kind of heaven-defying means that could create clouds and rain with a flip of his hand was clearly not an existence that Qin Wanqing could deal with. She couldn't help but feel afraid and wanted to leave this strange place as soon as possible. However, since she was already here, how could Chunshi let her go? This was his sister-in-law who had a lot to do with Yingying. He had to keep her. Therefore, as soon as Qin Shueqing turned around, Chunxi shouted at the big cat, "Big cat, keep the guest." Meow. The big cat had been living in fear all day recently. Now that it finally had a chance to show off, it naturally worked hard. Thus, just as Qin Wanqing took a step forward, a voice rang out. The big cat, who had been squatting on the steps of the west wing, had turned into a black shadow and rushed to the drooping flower door in an instant. As its body grew rapidly, Qin Shueqing couldn't help but widen her eyes. Monster? The big cat showed its true form. Its front legs were slightly bent, and its back legs were on the ground. Its body was slightly arched, and its eyes were fixed on Qin Shueqing. It even grinned, revealing a mouthful of sharp teeth. Seeing this, Qin Wanqing had no choice but to stop in her tracks. She hesitated for a moment, then turned around and shouted at Chunxi, "Who are you?" Hearing this, Chunxi could only shake his head and say helplessly, "I seem to remember telling you. My name is Chunxi. I am Qin Ruoying's husband, Chen Yin's father." "You." Qin Shueqing stomped her foot angrily. She didn't know what to do now. Not to mention this unfathomable man. Even the strange monster behind her was something she couldn't guarantee that she could walk past it unscathed. Just as Qin Shueqing was feeling vexed, the little girl suddenly saw the big cat squatting in front of the drooping flower door. She had seen too many amazing things today. But at this moment, when she saw the big cat's enlarged appearance, she couldn't help but raise her small hand and rub her eyes. "Big cat? Is that you?" The little girl and the big cat had been together for so long that they even used the same blanket. Therefore, almost without much thought, the little girl realized that this huge black panther was very similar to her big cat. In order to confirm its guess, the little brat ran toward the drooping flower gate. Meow, boss was here, so the big cat could only meow obediently as a greeting. After hearing that familiar voice, the little girl was excited. She didn't dare to approach at first, but when she heard the big cat's meow, she immediately opened her arms and pounced on it, then hugged the big cat's head. "Big cat. Big cat. Big cat. It's really you." The little girl was too excited, so she used her small hands to rub the big cat's head. The big cat's face was rubbed out of shape, but it didn't dare to hide. So it could only retract the barbs on its tongue and stick out its tongue to lick the little girl, until she didn't have time to rub it again. The little girl hugged the big cat and giggled happily. But then an idea suddenly appeared in her mind, so she immediately shouted happily, "Big cat, can I ride you?" It wasn't a question but a statement. So without waiting for the big cat to say anything, she was already hugging the big cat's neck and jumping with all her strength, trying to climb up its back. Unfortunately, she was too short. After the big cat grew up, it was at least 2/3 of her height, so the little girl couldn't climb up at all. Seeing this, the big cat could only obediently lower its body and let her ride on it. After the little girl sat down, the big cat stood up again, and the little girl hugged the big cat's neck with both hands, lying on top of it and giggling. "Big cat. Big cat. Go go go." In the courtyard, the big cat carried the little girl on its back, and under her constant urging, it had no choice but to run in circles around the courtyard. It didn't dare to run too fast, afraid that the little girl would fall. If the little girl accidentally fell, it estimated that all 4 of its legs would be broken by Chunxi. So it was better to be careful. Qin Shueqing stood in the same place, and her mind was blank. She stared blankly at everything that was happening in front of her. While in a trance, she felt dizzy. Thank you to the boss. Reading books is like life, for the 20,000 reward. Thank you to the boss, a mess for the 10,000 reward. Thank you to the boss, Assad, for the 30,000 reward. This book's reader group, 5117933123 group name. Destroy Earth Strategic Headquarters. Chapter 102. In the Qin family's courtyard. It should have been a place Qin Shueqing was very familiar with. But now this place felt very strange to her. It was all because of those 2 uninvited guests. No, it was 3. Because this black cat, which seemed to be a pet, was at least a monster that had cultivated for hundreds of years. Nian Nian rode the big cat, and jumped around the courtyard. In order to prevent her from falling, Chunxi specially put a rope around the big cat's neck, and made a simple rain for her. The little fellow was amazing now. In addition to hide and seek and 123 wooden men, she finally had one more entertainment. Riding the big cat. Riding the big cat was much more fun than riding Papa, so she didn't want to get down after riding it. She stuck to the big cat. It had no choice but to take her slowly round and round. Qin Xueqing stood on the steps of the east wing, looking at the child in front of her who was riding the Black Panther in circles, but she was very upset. This child was her sister's daughter, so what was her relationship with her? She frowned and thought for a while before she finally figured it out. She should be the child's aunt, and the child should be her niece. Aunt? Niece. Qin Xueqing stood on the steps, slightly lost in thought. At this time, the little fellow rode the big cat in front of her. Sister, do you want to play with me? I'll invite you to ride the big cat. Nian Nian didn't know that her snowman was destroyed by the woman in front of her, so she was very friendly to this strange woman who suddenly appeared in their house. However, after hearing her words, Qin Xueqing glared at the little fellow with slight disgust. The little fellow was so happy that she didn't realize that this woman didn't like her very much. However, the big cat under her felt it. So the big cat immediately grinned and growled. Meow. With a low growl of indignation, the big cat took the little guy and walked past her from behind. Looking at the big cat's attitude, it was also as arrogant as a pushover. It was not willing to let the little guy talk to this woman at all. The reason why Qin Xueqing was still standing here was because of Qin Xueqing. It wasn't that she didn't want to leave, but she couldn't. Every time she tried to leave, Qin would always use a method she couldn't understand to grab her back. It was as if there was an invisible hand stopping her. Even if she wanted to climb over the wall to escape, that hand would grab her and put her back into the courtyard. It was like being trapped in a toy castle, and she was just one of the toy soldiers. This kind of celestial means also completely cut off Qin Xueqing's idea of escape. Dao initiation, Dharma cultivation, ascension. The lineage of necromancers was too mysterious. Although Qin Xueqing had heard about it a long time ago, she didn't expect that a real necromancer with cultivation would be so terrible. Therefore, she was also very honored to become Chen-Shi's captive. Although she was a captive, she was actually treated well. Except for not being able to leave the courtyard, Chen-Shi didn't do anything to her. Or it could be said that Chen-Shi didn't dare to do anything to her. Did he want to tie her up and hang her upside down with a whip dripping wax? She was his sister-in-law, not an outsider. They were all family. Obviously, Chen-Shi couldn't offend her too much. Chen-Shi only had one purpose, and that was to make her tell him where Ying was. Perhaps seeing that Chen-Shi didn't dare to do anything to her, Qin Xueqing simply closed her mouth and refused to say a word. Chen-Shi couldn't do anything to her, so he could only let her be. His sister-in-law had just arrived. As her brother-in-law, he still had to be a little polite to her. However, Chen-Shi's patience was always limited. Therefore, he could only hope that Qin Xueqing wouldn't refuse a toast only to be forced to drink a forfeit. Otherwise, it would be embarrassing for everyone. Obviously, it wouldn't be a good thing. Because the little fellow didn't like to eat outside food, Chen-Shi had already started to cook as early as the second day after she moved in. Today there were distinguished guests, so Chen-Shi made a particularly sumptuous meal. 4 dishes and a soup, all of which were main dishes. One of the dishes was braised shark's fin in yellow sauce. This dish was characterized by its bright apricot yellow color, soft and tender meat, extremely mellow and fresh taste, and the whole wing was juicy. Because it was too cold, Chen-Shi could only put the dishes on the table in the west wing. After he brought the dishes one by one, the little fellow didn't even need to be called. She rushed over on the big cat as soon as she smelled the aroma. Papa! It smells so good. I'm hungry. If you're hungry, wash your hands. You can eat after washing your hands. Okay. Big cat, let's wash our hands. With the temptation of delicious food, the little mischievous girl finally didn't need Chen-Shi to wait on her. She ran to wash her hands by herself. At this time, Chen-Shi walked out of the room and looked at Qin Xueqing opposite him. He asked very politely, "Do you want to eat together?" As he spoke, Chen-Shi turned sideways and pointed to the table behind him. However, after hearing his words, Qin Xueqing was like a cat whose tail was stepped on. She immediately shouted angrily, "Bah!" After fiercely glaring at Chunxi, she opened the door of the east wing, walked in and slammed the door. The weather was so cold, but she still stood in the yard for so long in the cold wind. Thinking about it, it was quite silly. Chunxi smiled softly and returned to the west wing, very satisfied. The whole yard was set up by him. As long as Qin Shueqing didn't tell him the whereabouts of Yingying, she would have to obediently stay here for one more day. When he forced Qin Shueqing to stay just now, Chunxi had already used his true qi to search her body. However, Qin Shueqing didn't bring her mobile phone, so Chunxi couldn't check her phone number. 3 days. Chunxi only gave her 3 days to consider. If she still refused to tell him after 3 days, then don't blame him for not giving her face as her brother-in-law. Just as Chunxi was thinking about how to deal with Qin Shueqing, the little girl ran back after washing her hands. She climbed onto the chair with all her strength, picked up the spoon, and was ready to eat. However, at this time, the little girl seemed to have thought of something. She quickly turned her head and looked out of the window. Then she asked with some doubts, "Papa, where's that sister just now? Isn't she going to eat with us?" Hearing this, Chunxi rubbed her head and pulled the plate of braised shark's fin to her. Then he said with a smile, "She's your mother's sister." "Mama's sister? Who's that? You should call her Aunt." "Aunt? Aunt doesn't eat with us? She's good at martial arts, so she doesn't need to eat." "Oh, Aunt is so pitiful. The food is so delicious, but she doesn't need to eat." "Good girl, eat more if it's delicious." "Okay." However, at this moment, in the east wing, Qin Shueqing frowned slightly and couldn't help but put her hand on her stomach. Martial artists were not immortal cultivators. Their physical energy consumption was especially large, so their usual appetite was also especially large. She hadn't eaten for a few hours, but her stomach began to growl. Qin Shueqing couldn't help but look through the window at the west wing opposite. She finally understood why Chunxi pretended to ask her to eat with him. He guessed that she wouldn't go, so he used this method to disgust her. She couldn't beat him in a fight, and she couldn't leave. Now she couldn't even eat. Thinking of this, Qin Shueqing couldn't help but turn pale. She couldn't live like this. So, after hesitating for a while, Qin Shueqing kicked open the door and strode toward the west wing opposite. "I doubt it. Did you forget the name of my book? This is Becoming a Stay-at-Home Dad After Returning from Cultivation, not Becoming a Stay-at-Home King After Returning from Cultivation. I can't abandon my daily life for the sake of showing off, because that's a very stupid way of doing things. I have 2 kinds of readers. One likes to read cool stories, and the other likes to read warm daily lives. But recently, the readers who like to read cool stories have been making more and more trouble. It's even developed to the point where even Nian said that I'm lame. I really want the 2 kinds of readers to coexist, so there will be a big climax, but it will be a gradual process. Because in my heart, 100 face-slapping episodes are not as important as a complete climax. Right, bro? In addition, some people say that I'm half an article on Baidu. If I want a Baidu, I have to at least have this knowledge and know that this thing exists in advance, okay? I'm not here to teach popular science. But if I don't write, will other readers know about this? Chapter 103. Bang. With a stomach full of resentment, Qin Shueqing kicked the door of the west wing hard. However, what she got in response to her kick was an even stronger reaction force. It was obviously a wooden door, but it was as hard as the door of a bank vault. It was obvious that Chunxi was making trouble. Qin Shueqing gritted her teeth and helplessly withdrew her right foot. Because she was so angry, her full chest rose and fell rapidly with her rapid breathing. This was great. She couldn't even open the door. But if she went back in resentment, she felt very unwilling. But if she knocked on the door properly, she couldn't bring herself to do it. The snow had stopped. But the cold wind was still whistling. Qin Shueqing stood at the door of the west wing with resentment. She didn't know what to do now. She finally understood what despair was. It was the first time she had experienced such a feeling in her life. She couldn't beat him and she couldn't run away. With her status, it was impossible for her to curse in the streets like a shrew. What else could she do? Chun-Shi was like an experienced hunter, and she was like an injured prey, being wantonly played by Chun-Shi in the palm of her hand. The more Qin Shueching thought about it, the angrier she became. So she immediately turned and walked back to the east wing. Her stubbornness also came up. She was a martial arts grandmaster in the clasping Dan realm. Even if she didn't eat or drink for a month, she wouldn't die. At worst, she would go back and slowly waste time with him. Qin Shueching made up her mind. But when she turned and was about to leave, the door behind her suddenly opened. The little fellow turned and saw Qin Shueching outside the room, so she immediately took the spoon and waved it happily. As she waved, she shouted happily, "Auntie! Aunt! Do you want to eat with us?" The little fellow enthusiastically invited Qin Shueching. However, Qin Shueching was not in the mood to eat at this moment, so she did not even turn her head and walked directly to the east wing. However, the moment she took a step forward, she was horrified to find that she could not control her body. An invisible force suddenly seized control of her body and manipulated her to slowly turn her body. At this moment, she was like a remote-controlled robot. Under the control of someone else, she walked stiffly towards the west wing. Seeing that, Qin Shueching shouted in fear, "What did you do to me? Let me go." Chun-Shi didn't pay attention to her, but smiled and controlled her to sit next to the little guy. After that, Chun-Shi stroked the little girl's head and asked softly, "Nian Nian, can you go and get a bowl of rice for your aunt?" "All right." Hearing that, the little fellow immediately nodded happily, then jumped off the chair and ran to the rice cooker to fill Qin Shueching's bowl with rice. Although she did not understand what the word aunt meant, as long as it had something to do with mama, the little fellow would show full enthusiasm. While the little fellow went to get more rice, Chun-Shi turned to look at Qin Shueching and asked with a smile, "What do you think? Isn't my daughter cute?" Qin Shueching struggled to get rid of Chun-Shi's restraint, but it was obviously in vain. Therefore, she had to scold him harshly. "Let me go." "I can let you go, but you have to eat this meal first." Chun-Shi smiled and pointed to the dishes on the table. Qin Shueching did not answer, but glared at him fiercely. "Aunt, the rice." The little fellow quickly ran back with the bowl, and then happily raised the bowl in front of Qin Shueching. Seeing that, Qin Shueching was still a little hesitant. Chun-Shi did not talk nonsense with her, and immediately controlled her to take the bowl from the little fellow's hand. Qin Shueching flew into a rage, and wanted to scold Chun-Shi. But at this time she found that she could move again. After being stunned for a moment, Qin Shueching's first reaction was to leave here. But just as she moved, Chun-Shi restrained her again. "You." Qin Wanqing wanted to say something, but as soon as she said a word, it was as if someone was strangling her neck. She swallowed the words that she was about to say. Chun-Shi glanced at her lightly and said calmly, "Eat." At this time, the little fellow also ran back to her seat, took the spoon and was ready to start again. After drinking a mouthful of fresh soup with great satisfaction, the little fellow found that Qin Shueching still held the bowl just now, so she asked with some doubts, "Aunt, why don't you eat?" Seeing the little fellow's puzzled face, Qin Shueching collapsed. After being tormented by Chun-Shi, she was so angry that she was about to cry. She would rather be beaten to death by Chun-Shi than be humiliated by Chun-Shi so wantonly. Yes, humiliated. Like a doll, Chun-Shi held her in his hand and played with her casually. She tried for a while, and found that she could speak. She immediately said quickly, "Let me go, I'll eat." As soon as she finished speaking, she found that she could move. So Qin Shueching held the bowl in one hand and the chopsticks in the other, stiffly digging into the bowl of steaming white rice. She didn't take any food and just ate the rice. Seeing that she didn't take any food, Chun-Shi said with a smile, "You're a guest. Don't just eat. Try the food I made." Hearing this, Qin Shueching's movements paused. Then a line of tears suddenly fell from her face. She was angry and cried because of Chun-Shi. Chun-Shi didn't expect that he could make his sister-in-law cry, so he quickly asked the little fellow, "Nian Nian, are you full?" "I'm full. I'm so full." "Then go watch cartoons with Big Cat." Okay. When it came to cartoons, the little fellow was full of energy. So, when Chun-Shi put her on the ground, she shouted for Big Cat to watch cartoons on the bed. After the little fellow left, Chunxi turned to look at Qin Xueqing. At this time, Qin Xueqing had secretly wiped away the tears on her face. Let's talk. Qin Xueqing didn't say anything, but lowered her head and continued to dig into the white rice in her hand. She didn't have the arrogance she had when she first arrived. Instead, she looked more like a little woman who had been wronged. This was also the result that Chunxi wanted. Seeing that she had finally removed the layers of shell, Chunxi asked again, I'm really curious. Why did you have a flash of murderous intent when you first saw Nian Nian? Qin Xueqing was stunned. She didn't expect that Chunxi could even feel this. You should be glad that the murderous intent in your heart disappeared in a flash. Otherwise, I think we might not even have the chance to sit here and talk. The so-called murderous intent and murderous intent. One represented the desire to kill, the other represented the preparation to kill. The two didn't seem to be very different, but there was an essential difference. The murderous intent was an idea that came out in an instant, while the murderous intent was the breath before the preparation to kill. Qin Xueqing was a master of martial arts. So every time she was ready to make a move, the muscles all over her body would naturally tighten, and the pores would immediately contract and close. If it was a master of the same level, he would naturally be able to detect all kinds of subtle changes in her body. This was the so-called murderous intent, which also meant that she was about to make a move. The murderous intent could be perceived, but the murderous intent couldn't be perceived, because the murderous intent was just a kind of thought. Unless one could see through people's hearts, how could one perceive the thoughts of others? Chunxi couldn't see through people's hearts, but he could infer from Qin Xueqing's subtle expression at that moment. Qin Xueqing should really be glad. The murderous intent in her heart came and went quickly. Otherwise, she would really be crushed to death by Chunxi on the spot. Qin Xueqing didn't answer. Chunxi smiled and continued. You are very strange. I guess you haven't even killed a chicken, but today you want to kill a child, and it's your sister's child. Tell me why? After that, Chunxi looked at her quietly. Qin Xueqing held the bowl and lowered her head as if she was thinking. She was silent for a long time. Chunxi also waited for her for a long time. Chapter 104. Because if she doesn't die, my sister will die. As soon as he finished speaking, Qin Xueqing clearly felt a strong murderous aura erupting from Chunxi's body. The murderous aura was so strong that she was so scared that her muscles tensed up, and she subconsciously wanted to take a defensive stance. And it wasn't just her. Even the big cat who was watching cartoons was shocked. But the big cat was very smart and immediately burrowed into the little guy's arms. The little guy naturally hugged the big cat. This behavior was like a solid reassuring pill for the big cat. So after the big cat calmed down, it turned its head and poked its head out to observe the situation at the dining table. Why? Chunxi's voice was very calm, and there was nothing strange about the expression on his face. But his body was constantly emitting a monstrous murderous aura. He was a cultivator, not a warrior. So when he was angry, the surrounding spirit energy would also surge. Therefore, Qin Xueqing was a master after all. So even if she didn't see any signs of Chunxi wanting to attack, she could clearly sense that Chunxi wanted to kill someone. This brother-in-law of hers, who had been hiding his strength, finally showed his fangs. Qin Xueqing was a little lost in thought, as if she didn't hear Chunxi's words. So Chunxi asked again, why? Ah. Qin Xueqing's body suddenly trembled, and then she looked at Chunxi with a complicated expression. She reluctantly shook her head and said, I can't tell you. I shouldn't have come to you at all. I was meddlesome. Hearing this, Chunxi suddenly laughed. You brought that necklace over for her, didn't you? After saying this, Chunxi looked thoughtfully at the little guy who was sitting on the bed and watching cartoons attentively. Qin Xueqing didn't reply. You want to drive us away, because you're afraid that your family will find out that Yingying gave birth to a daughter for me, right? Qin Xueqing still didn't speak. Chunxi waited for a long time. Seeing that she didn't want to speak again, Chunxi changed the topic and asked with interest. If I remember correctly, those who are above transforming strength are called masters, so you should be a martial arts master, right? Hearing this, Qin Wanqing finally nodded and replied somewhat reluctantly, Above the neutral strength stage is the controlled dance stage. Only after achieving the controlled dance stage can one become a grandmaster. I've seen people at the peak strength stage, but they are older than you and have been through hundreds of battles. They always have a kind of hostility that can't be hidden. You don't have it, and your realm is far higher than theirs. So you do have some reason to be proud. However, when she heard Chen Shi's zest, Qin Shiueqing immediately frowned and scolded in exasperation. Are you trying to humiliate me? Don't think that you're so great. If we're at the same level, I can kill you as easily as killing a chicken within 10 steps. Really? Chen Shi pretended to look at her in surprise. Then he asked with a smile. In fact, I'm very curious. Have you ever killed a chicken? Qin Shiueqing was irritated by him again. She got up and wanted to leave. But how could Chen Shi let her go? So the moment she got up, Chen Shi stopped her again and said with a smile, Don't be angry, don't be angry. Today is the first time we've met, and I want to talk to you more. What do you want? Nothing. As long as you tell me where Yingying is, I'll let you go right away. Qin Shiueqing was stunned. After being stunned for a while, she seemed to think of something and said with a look of contempt, Even if I tell you, what can you do? Since you're a necromancer, let me ask you, do you know the Gate of Heaven? Gate of Heaven? What's that? Chen Shi was a little confused. It was the first time he had heard of this term. Qin Shiueqing saw his confused look and couldn't help laughing. You don't even know the Gate of Heaven. It was as if she had found something very funny. Qin Shiueqing laughed louder and louder. In the end, even the little fellow was alarmed by her laughter. The little fellow turned her head and glanced at this strange ant. Then she continued to watch cartoons with the big cat in her arms. Chen Shi didn't speak, but looked at her quietly. He was as calm as a pool of stagnant water, without any ripples. Qin Shiueqing laughed for a while, but when she saw Chen Shi's indifferent look, her face fell again. Bah! Summer insects can't talk about ice, and frogs in the well can't talk about the sea. You're really like an arrogant toad. Oh, is that so? Chen Shi also laughed with her and asked, The Gate of Heaven you're talking about, is it the southern gate of the heavenly court? As long as you walk through the southern gate, you can be ranked as an immortal? Hearing this, Qin Shiueqing laughed and said, If you want to understand it that way, it's actually not wrong. And then? Chen Shi spread his hands and asked with a puzzled look, What does that have to do with me? Qin Shiueqing was choked by his words. She felt like she was playing the lute to a cow. Therefore, she couldn't help but say angrily, My sister and I are Xian Nu who presides over the Gate of Heaven. If the Gate of Heaven doesn't open, we can't get married. If people find out that she has a child, my sister will be burned alive. Oh, I see. Chen Shi nodded, then suddenly stood up and began to clean up the tableware on the table. After realizing that she had said something wrong, Qin Shiueqing stared at him blankly. After a while, she asked hesitantly, What else do you want? My sister asked me to give you the necklace, so that you can forget about her. We are Xian Nu. We can't get married. Hearing this, Chen Shi said as he cleaned up, Yingying knows about this rule, right? But she still chose to give birth to Nianyan, which means that she doesn't want to be a Xian Nu, right? Qin Shiueqing didn't reply. When Chen Shi looked at her, her eyes were also a little evasive, as if she didn't dare to look at Chen Shi. Since Yingying doesn't want to be a Xian Nu, do you think I should take her home? Hearing this, Qin Shiueqing suddenly became anxious and couldn't help but exclaim, No, you can't go. You'll kill my sister. Kill her? No, I'm going to take her home. Qin Shiueqing was a little agitated and wanted to say something more. But at this time, Chen Shi suddenly waved his sleeve. Then her whole body flew straight out of the courtyard like a kite, and then suspended in the middle of the courtyard, unable to move. After binding her in the middle of the courtyard, Chen Shi slowly walked out of the west wing. He raised his head and looked at Qin Shiueqing calmly. After a moment of silence, Chen Shi asked calmly, Tell me, where is Yingying? Qin Shiueqing hesitated for a moment, but still chose to shut up. However, Chen Shi's next sentence suddenly made her face change greatly. If you don't say it, I'll burn you now. Chen Shi's appearance didn't change at all, and his expression was still calm. But Qin Xueqing seemed to feel that the man standing in front of her now, he was like a wolf that had taken off its sheepskin, completely revealing the ferocious nature in his bones. Well, I'm different from most writers, because I can't stand trolls. I've been a failure for a long time, so I won't condone trolls acting presumptuously in front of me. There was already a wave of trolls when the female lead was in the lead role, and now there's another wave of trolls for my sister-in-law. Forcibly whitewashing. Lowering IQ? Illogical? Explaining too much will disgust other readers. So I won't open a chapter to explain the motives of my sister-in-law's behavior. The following is the extras. Chunshi took the little fellow to play the single plank bridge. Halfway through, the little fellow felt it was very simple. So she asked Chunshi to let go of her. And she wanted to walk by herself. Chunshi couldn't persuade her, so he had to let go of her. The little fellow tried to take a step or two. She found it was very simple. So she was a little proud. She wanted to jump directly to the opposite side. But just as she was jumping happily, her feet suddenly slipped and she accidentally fell down. The little fellow fell to the ground and hurt, and immediately cried loudly, constantly blaming Chunshi for not holding her properly. Seeing this, Chunshi had to hold the little fellow tightly, comforting her with a guilty face. Nian, I'm sorry, it's all Dad's fault. Dad didn't take good care of you. Dad apologizes to you, okay? Chapter 105. The biggest difference between the heavenly jade world and Earth was, spirit stones, immortal herbs, cave abodes, and spirit veins could be snatched. Interest was the driving force behind all human actions. Marx once said, everything that people strive for is related to their interests. Chunshi had lived on Earth for more than 20 years. But he had lived in the heavenly jade world for more than 500 years. Could it be that those 500 years could not compare to 20 years? Obviously not. The reason why he did not like the heavenly jade world was mainly because there was a fundamental difference between the heavenly jade world and Earth. Earth was the place where he was born and raised. Chunshi grew up and matured here. His outlook on life, values, and worldview had formed the most basic framework because of this. So after he went to the heavenly jade world, he always felt that he did not fit in with that world. This was also one of the reasons why he risked his life to return to his roots. 3 years old is old, 7 years old is old. This was a proverb in Huaxia. Although 3 years old and 7 years old was only an approximate number in ancient times, it was summed up by the people of Huaxia after thousands of years of living experience. This sentence seemed very arbitrary, but it was proven to be reasonable by modern science. Man is a very complicated creature. If he really wanted to explore it in detail, he would have to talk about innate determinants and acquired influences. That was too complicated, and Chunshi was not a thinker, so he would not study too much. He only needed to clarify one thing, and that was, what exactly did he want? Chunshi did not want longevity, but family happiness. This was his goal, and also his pursuit. At the same time, it was the source of his motivation. Nian was already by his side, so Chunshi swore to make her the happiest child in the world. But Ying was still missing. Without Ying, how could Nian be the happiest child in the world? Without Ying, how would he be able to achieve the family happiness that he pursued? Without Ying, how could he fulfill the promise he made back then? I will ascend and become an immortal. Not for longevity, but for a lifetime of happiness and peace. If it was said that living on Earth for more than 20 years had established a basic framework for Chunshi's worldview. However, the 500 years in heavenly spiral had reshaped Chunshi's code of conduct. In the end, he was no longer a mortal. He was a titled divine lord of the heavenly jade domain, a soul formation cultivator. Therefore, when Chunshi heard that Ying was in danger, there was only one thought left in his mind. Pick up Ying and go home. The home that he guarded. Compared to his wife, his sister-in-law was naturally an insignificant existence. Therefore, Qin Xueqing was suddenly thrown out of the yard. She stared at the man in horror. This seemingly gentle man suddenly showed his ferocious side in front of her. That monstrous murderous aura seemed to be making a silent declaration. If she dared to say no, he would really kill her. Qin Xueqing was scared out of her wits. Chunchi stood on the steps and quietly looked at Qin Xueqing, who was tied up in the air by him. All of a sudden, his wrist twitched. Immediately after, a small flame jumped out from his fingertip. Seeing the sudden flame, Qin Xueqing finally came back to her senses. This cheap brother-in-law was serious about her. Qin Xueqing was scared. When she saw that Chunchi was about to throw out the flame, she immediately shouted at the top of her lungs, "No! I'll tell you." Classic of Mountains and Seas? The 16th classic of the West of the Great Wilderness said, "In the south of the West Sea, on the shore of quicksand, behind the red water and before the black water, there is a mountain called the Kunlun Hills." The Kunlun Mountains were known as the ancestor of all mountains in Huaxia, and the source of the dragon veins. Many legends in Huaxia were related to the Kunlun Mountains. But many people didn't know. The Kunlun Mountains in ancient times and the Kunlun Mountains in modern times were actually two different places. Some people even thought that the ancient Kunlun Mountains were the current Kunlun Mountains. The current Kunlun Mountains were between 500 meters and 6,000 meters above sea level. The climate was cold and humid, the air was thin, and there was a plateau layer of frozen soil all year round. The living conditions were extremely bad. How could the Huaxia people be born? In fact, according to historical records, long before the Qin dynasty unified Huaxia, what was called the Kunlun Mountains was actually the Qinling Mountains. The Guanzhong Plain north of the Qinling Mountains was the birthplace of the Huaxia people. The two ancestors of the Huaxia people, the Yellow Emperor and the Yan Emperor, were born in this place. The Guoyujin language said, "In the past, Xiaodian married the Eugene family and gave birth to the Yellow Emperor and the Yan Emperor. The Yellow Emperor was born with Ji Shui, and the Yan Emperor was born with Jiang Shui. Therefore, the Yellow Emperor was born with Ji Shui, and the Yan Emperor was born with Jiang Shui. The two emperors used their masters to help each other, and they were born with different virtues." This was also the earliest historical record of the Yan Emperor and the Yellow Emperor that could be seen. The Qinling Mountains were not called Qinling Mountains in the beginning. At first it was called the Kunlun Mountains. Later, Qin Shi Huang unified Huaxia and moved the capital to Xianyang. Because the Qinling Mountains stood in the south of Xianyang, the capital of the Qin state, there was a saying, "In the sky in the south of the capital," so it was called Zhongnan, also known as Zhongnan. Therefore, the Qinling Mountains were called Zhongnan Mountains. Later, the Qin dynasty fell, and it was the Western Han dynasty. Sima Qian wrote in the history books, "The Qinling Mountains are the greatest obstacle in the world." At this time, the Qinling Mountains finally had its official name. Kunlun Mountains, Zhongnan Mountains, Qinling Mountains. These were the past and present lives of the Qinling Mountains. Huaxia's dragon vein was actually here. Chang'an. At the airport exit. A family of 3 and a cat. The man was handsome, the woman was beautiful, and the baby was quite cute. Even the cat in the child's arms looked more agile and clever. It stuck its head out and looked at the passers-by. The family of 3 did not look like locals. After getting off the exit, they took a taxi and went straight to the Qinling Mountains. The Qinling Mountains were a huge mountain range across Huaxia. At the same time, it was also the climate dividing line between the north and south of Huaxia. The difference in the lives of southerners and northerners was formed by this mountain range. Every winter, the Guanzhong area north of the Qinling Mountains was bitterly cold. Thousands of miles of ice would be frozen and thousands of miles of snow would fall. People would stay by the fire to get through this cold season. However, the Hanzhong Basin south of the Qinling Mountains was still green with mountains and rivers. This mountain range had a decisive impact on the natural climate of Huaxia. It was also this mountain range that changed the natural pattern of Huaxia. The family of 3 booked a taxi. They were not going to a scenic area, but to a remote town at the foot of the Qinling Mountains. The people of northern Shaanxi were forthright, the people of southern Shaanxi were simple and honest, and the people of Guanzhong were warm. This trip would take more than 2 hours. It was a long journey. The driver wanted to start a conversation several times, but the young couple in the car was like a sulking couple. They did not say a word since they got in the car. There was no other way. Since the guests were not willing to talk, he could only keep his mouth shut silently. The straight-line distance from Chang'an to the Qinling Mountains was only 50 to 60 kilometers. It had not snowed in Chang'an yet, but the Qinling Mountains had already turned into a vast expanse of white. The town they were going to was about 200 kilometers away from Chang'an. When they were about to reach the town, it started to drizzle. The weather was dark and the rain was hazy. There was also a thick fog on the mountain. When they looked up, they could only see a misty expanse. They had made a lot of money on this trip, so the driver was very polite and gave them an umbrella. He was also a little curious about this family of three, so after he left, he glanced at them through the rearview mirror. There were some raindrops on the rearview mirror. Through the mirror, he saw the family of three slowly walking up the mountain path. Going up the mountain on such a cold day? Old man, don't rush me. I really can't write that much. Think about it. You know that I'm here to write books to make money. Do you think I can't live with the money? The background of this book is very large. The foreshadowing has to be linked together, so it's very difficult for me to write it. Please, can you please understand? Even if it's on Baidu, I have to check it one by one. After digesting it, I'll put it into my settings. This chapter contains too much information. I wrote until 3 a.m. last night, and woke up at 12 a.m. today. I've only just finished writing it now. After writing it, I still have to wait to be scolded for being a fake. Sometimes, I really feel that I've been wronged. Please, I hope you can understand. I've really worked very hard. I'll promote the book for you. There are 3 successful nanny dads on Qidian now. You can also read Nanny Dad's Literary Life and Nanny Dad's Restaurant in Another World. My speed can't be compared to theirs. Nanny Dad's Restaurant in Another World will be a hit. That's something I don't even dare to think about. Although we're all nannies, the things we write are actually different. Chapter 106. The Qinling Mountains lay across the border between the north and the south of Huaxia. It was the mountains that divided the north and the south, the earth cut the rivers, and the east and west meandered. The vast momentum and continuous magnificence made it difficult for people to see the whole picture, but they had to explore. The world was big and chaotic. It was rare that the mountains were still there. The fog was rising, and the snow was boundless. It was an otherworldly scene. Unlike the handsomeness of Mount Imei, the Qinling Mountains gave people a sense of vastness. After going up the mountain, the little fellow obediently lay in Chunxi's arms, her big eyes rolling. As the altitude increased, the snow on the mountain became thicker and thicker. The somewhat rugged and slippery path was gradually covered by the snow. Looking up, it seemed that there was only white left between heaven and earth. When the little fellow saw the thick snow piled up like a quilt, she finally couldn't help but hug Chunxi's neck and said coquettishly, Papa, I want to play in the snow." Hearing this, Chunxi stopped, pinched her little face, and then put her down in a relatively flat place. Seeing the thick layer of snow in front of her, the little fellow also became playful. She was holding the big cat and suddenly swung her arms with all her strength. Just like that, he threw the big cat into the pile of snow. The big cat was shocked, and suddenly it was so scared that it waved its 4 feet in the air. But because it had no place to borrow strength, it could only watch as the little fellow threw it out. Poof! It was now the size of a pet cat, so after falling into the snow, it only made a small shallow hole. Meow! The big cat cried out with some dissatisfaction, causing the little fellow to giggle. Then she hopped to the edge of the pile of snow and shouted, "I'm here!" Then he jumped into the snow as well. The snow looked as soft as cotton, but it was definitely not as warm and cold as cotton. But after she jumped into the snow, she immediately rolled in it as if she was not afraid of the cold at all. Her wish of rolling in the snow finally came true. While Little Rascal and Big Cat were rolling around in the snow, Chunxi looked at Qin Shihueching and suddenly asked, "What do you think? Is my daughter cute?" This was the second time that Chunxi had asked this question. Qin Shihueching looked at him with a complicated expression, and then turned her eyes to the little fellow. A 4-year-old child was the cutest, so no matter how unwilling she was, Qin Shihueching could only reply dryly, "Cute." "Thank you." Chunxi smiled and nodded, as if he was very satisfied with her answer. Qin Shihueching wanted to say something, but when she thought about how Chunxi had threatened to burn her to death, she couldn't help but sulk. She walked to the side alone and sulked. The conversation stopped abruptly. The huge mountain was very quiet. Only the little fellow's shouts could be heard. The cold wind in the mountain whistled, and a series of snowflakes swirled in the sky, drifting toward the foot of Mount Qinling. After playing for a while, the little fellow found that it was really cold, so she ran back. "Papa, it's so cold, so cold." As she spoke, she jumped and shivered. The process of melting snow itself was a process of absorbing heat. When rolling in the snow would fall into the clothes. As soon as it met the body temperature, it would immediately melt into water. So no matter how much she liked the snow, she had to run back to Chenxi to get warm. Chenxi quickly picked her up. As his true essence surged, Little Rascal's body immediately emitted a faint white gas. A stream of warmth wrapped her, and Little Rascal immediately murmured comfortably, "It's so warm. Papa is so warm." When it could freeload food and drink, Big Cat would never be willing to fall behind others. So when it saw Little Rascal being held by Chenxi, it immediately shook off the snow on its body and jumped into Little Rascal's arms like a mad dog. The reason why it was willing to follow Chenxi was that a trace of Chenxi's true essence inadvertently leaked out was enough for it to benefit a lot. When the heavy snow closed the mountain, there were no birds in the mountains, and no traces of people could be found. But even a master of peak strength could walk on water, not to mention Qin Xueqing, who was a guru. Perhaps it was because she wanted to compete with Chenxi, so as soon as she entered the mountain, she stepped on the snow and floated away. In an instant, she had already rushed several meters away. A guru was like a dragon, climbing the mountain like an ape, diving into the water like an otter, and his momentum was like Mount Tai. After being tortured by Chenxi, Qin Xueqing almost doubted whether she was still a Wu Dao guru. Now that his sister-in-law was willing to cooperate, Chenxi naturally would not provoke her for no reason, so he followed her leisurely. As the two of them moved forward quickly, they went deep into the hinterland of the Qinling Mountains in the blink of an eye. At this time, Chenxi also roughly guessed where the mysterious place she was talking about was. Because as they went deeper and deeper, Chenxi found that the spiritual qi of heaven and earth here was even richer than that of Zongnanhai. It was really a good place for all things to compete. After walking for more than an hour, Qin Xueqing suddenly stopped. Chenxi looked at the valley in front of her and also stopped, because he knew that Qin Xueqing had something to say. Sure enough, after Qin Xueqing stopped, she turned her head, and the expression on her face showed that she was struggling. Chenxi waited for her for a moment, then she said in a seemingly annoyed tone, "I was wrong, I shouldn't have brought you here. Even if you kill me now, I won't take you one step further. Without me leading the way, you won't be able to enter, so you should go back. Since we're already here, do you think it's possible for me to go back? You really can't go any further. If you do this, not only will you kill yourself and my sister, but you will also kill the child in your arms. For the sake of the child, please go back, okay? Go back first, and when the divine gate opens, I will naturally come back to find you." Qin Xueqing became more and more agitated as she spoke. In the end, she could not help but yell at Chenxi again. Chenxi did not reply. After she calmed down a little, he nodded at Qin Xueqing and said very solemnly, "Thank you." "You." Qin Xueqing was stunned for a moment, then she flew into a rage and her face turned red. Just as she was about to scold Chenxi suddenly asked, "You're a grandmaster, so what's the corresponding realm of a grandmaster? I don't have time to joke with you. I'm warning you, if you go any further, you will really kill everyone. Answer my question first." Chenxi's expression was very serious, as if he was seriously discussing something with her. Seeing this, Qin Xueqing stomped her foot and said impatiently, "Entering the Tao. What's above that? Cultivating the Tao. Above that? Aren't you at the divine connection realm? Answer my question first, then what's above that? Core condensation. Isn't Grandmaster controlled Dan? What's the difference between core controlled Dan and core condensation? The two can't be described in the same sentence. Legend has it that when a Grandmaster successfully condenses his Dan, he will be able to leave the earth and ascend to immortality, free and unfettered between heaven and earth. Core concentration refers to a martial artist condensing the essence, qi, and blood marrow of the entire body into a single point. In other words, all the strength in the body is concentrated in the dantian. When facing an enemy, the dantian will explode, and the enemy will be killed in a single move. Alright, I have no more questions. After saying that, Chen-Shi carried the little fellow and walked towards the valley. Qin Xueqing wanted to reach out and stop him, but when she thought about how she was not a match for him, she could not help but stop. Obviously, Chen-Shi had tortured her until she was traumatized. Helpless, Qin Xueqing could only stomp her foot and shout at Chen-Shi's back. I've said it before, without me leading the way, you can't enter. Just as she finished speaking, the scene in front of her stunned her. Chen-Shi waved his sleeves lightly, and a door of light rippled like the surface of a lake appeared in front of him. Behind the door at the entrance of the valley, a stone tablet suddenly appeared in the originally empty space. On the stone tablet were 2 large words written in small seal script. Chapter 107. The little fellow stared blankly at the light gate that suddenly appeared in front of her. This door of light was transparent. If it wasn't for the faint light it was emitting and the ripples it was emitting, it would really look like an ordinary glass door. Even an adult would not be able to understand this situation, let alone a 4-year-old girl. Papa, what's this? The little girl stared at Chen-Shi with her cute big eyes, and after looking at Chen-Shi with a surprised expression, she stretched out her left index finger and gently poked at the door of light. Then, when her finger touched the light gate, she felt nothing. It was as if she was touching air. Her finger went through the light gate, as if she was putting her hand into water. The surface of the water kept shaking, and her fingers started to shake as well. The light gate shook, and so did her finger. The little fellow was amused. She stretched out her finger and kept poking the light gate. She felt nothing, but when she saw her finger rippling with the ripples, she giggled happily. Looking at her happy little face, Chen-Shi couldn't help but ask with a smile, "Do you like it?" "I like it. It's so fun." The little fellow giggled and lay on Chen-Shi's arm. Then she raised her head high, and her little chin was almost in the sky. "Papa will take you in to play, okay?" "Okay." The father and daughter quickly reached a consensus. Then Chen-Shi looked back at Qin Xueqing and asked with a smile, "What about you? Do you want to go with us?" Qin Xueqing looked at him in a daze. This mountain guarding formation was left by the ancient sages. How could it fail? Chen-Shi looked at her strangely. Seeing that she didn't speak, he stepped directly into the light gate with the little fellow in his arms. "Wait. I'll go with you." At this time, Qin Xueqing suddenly reacted and ran after him. "I'll take you in. But you'd better leave her here. Don't you still have a monster? If you let this monster keep an eye on her, there shouldn't be any problem. I'll go in with you. It'll be more convenient for us to move around." Qin Xueqing pointed at the big cat in the little fellow's arms, trying to persuade Chen-Shi to leave the little fellow outside. Hearing this, Chen-Shi gently shook his head and answered with certainty, "Yingying is my wife and Nianyan's mother. Since it's to bring her mother home, how can she be absent?" After that, Chen-Shi lowered his head and glanced at the little fellow. Although the little fellow did not understand the meaning of Qin Xueqing, she understood the meaning of Chen-Shi's words. Therefore, she immediately said excitedly, "I want to take Mama home." As she spoke, the little girl seemed to be a little embarrassed. She buried her little face in Chen-Shi's chest. Bashfully sitting in Chen-Shi's arms, she kept twisting her small body. The word mother had already become a simple concept in her mind. Other children had mothers, so naturally, she should have a mother too. This was all she knew about her mother. Although she was a little unfamiliar with it, she still had some desire. Chen-Shi touched the little fellow's head and smiled at Qin Xueqing. He carried the little fellow and walked straight to the valley in front. Qin Xueqing's expression was a little uncertain. While she was still hesitating, Chen-Shi was almost at the side of the stone tablet. Seeing this, Qin Xueqing could only stomp her feet and shout, "Wait! I'll take you there." After saying that, she also stepped through the door of light. When she stepped through the door of light, it suddenly disappeared. Qin Xueqing looked at the original position of the light door with a complicated expression. After shaking her head, she quickly caught up with Chunxi. After passing the stone tablet, they entered the valley. A seemingly ancient village suddenly appeared in front of Chunxi. It was as if it was recorded in the peach blossom spring. After dozens of steps, it suddenly became clear. The land was flat, and the houses were upright. There were fertile fields, beautiful ponds, mulberry trees and bamboo trees. The roads were crisscrossed, and chickens and dogs could be heard. However, it was a pity that it was winter now, and snow was falling from the sky. Therefore, standing outside the village, there was no one at all. Qin Xueqing came from behind. After passing by Chunxi, she led Chunxi quietly into the village. This village was actually very big, and there were probably hundreds of families. Qin Xueqing's pretty face was tense, and she was almost in her battle state. Along the way, she had clearly stepped on the snow, but she did not leave any footprints. Looking at her cautious appearance, she was no different from a thief. The village was very quiet. At this time, the little fellow turned her little head and said with some doubts, "Papa, it's so strange here." Her voice was not loud, but in Qin Xueqing's ears, it was no different from a sudden clap of thunder. Hence, she was immediately given a huge fright as every strand of hair on her body stood on end. Qin Xueqing quickly turned her head and glared at the little fellow fiercely. Being glared at so fiercely, the little fellow was a little frightened. She quickly pouted and shrank into Chunxi's arms. Seeing this, Chunxi also glared at Qin Xueqing fiercely. At the same time, he did not forget to threaten her. "If you dare to glare at her again, I will gouge out your eyes." "You." Qin Xueqing was just about to say something, but she immediately realized that now was not the time to quarrel. Therefore, she had to take a deep breath and suppress the evil fire in the bottom of her heart. At this time, Chunxi ignored her and continued to walk forward. Seeing this, Qin Xueqing suddenly became anxious. She quickly floated in front of Chunxi and pointed to a side path, indicating that he should go around it. However, Chunxi did not pay attention to her at all. He carried the little fellow and walked straight ahead. There was a large square in the center of the village. It was about the size of 2 basketball courts. In the center, there was an ancient bronze cauldron about 2 meters high. Because of the heavy snow, the ancient cauldron had been covered with a thick layer of snow. There were even a few icicles hanging from the protruding ears of the cauldron. In the north of the square, there was an old building that looked like an ancestral hall. The door of the old building was closed tightly, and it looked quite solemn and solemn. Chunxi did not seem to need Qin Xueqing to lead the way. After arriving at the square, he went straight through the square, and then walked quickly up the mountain along a small path in the northwest corner of the square. Qin Xueqing followed behind him looking nervous. She wanted to say something, but she did not dare to make a sound. She wanted to stop Chunxi, but she was afraid that she would be made by Chunxi again. So she had to follow Chunxi helplessly, constantly looking around, for fear that someone would discover them. Behind the ancestral hall, there was a small hill, estimated to be about 20 or 30 meters high. There was only a winding path to go up. Chunxi came to the foot of the hill and looked at the small hill thoughtfully. When he saw the circle of walls on the hill, there were some subtle changes in his eyes. Qin Xueqing noticed Chunxi's strange behavior. Just as she was about to approach Chunxi and was about to say something to him, Chunxi suddenly carried the little fellow and flew straight up. Qin Xueqing hesitated for a moment, but it was too late for her to regret it now. So she had to look as if she was facing death calmly and quickly jumped up with Chunxi. "Again, it's not a matter of money. It's that I really can't write it. Even if I write something, it never reaches the feeling I want. The more I write, the more dissatisfied I am. I delete and rewrite and still not satisfied, delete and rewrite again. In short, it's up to me if I can get through this. I've forgotten to thank all the bosses for their 10,000 coin rewards. Now that they're all together. Thank you to the boss of A Mess for your 10,000 reward. Thank you to the boss of Xiaozhongyu for your 20,000 reward. Thank you to the boss of Little Devil Child and Little Urchin for your 10,500 reward. Thank you to Brother Katatsumuri for your 10,000 reward. Thank you to the boss of Sanyu Wu Mengsheng for your 10,000 reward. Thank you to the boss of God with Nothing to Do for your 9,000 reward. Thank you to the boss of riding a turtle to the heavens for your 11,500 reward. Thank you to the boss of rising dawn, withering summer flowers for your 10,000 reward. Thank you to the boss of Sanhuafeng for your 10,000 reward. Chapter 108. Chen-Shi had already flown with the little fellow once, so this time she didn't seem to be too excited. There was only a small courtyard on the hillside behind the ancestral hall. Chen-Shi didn't fly directly into the courtyard. Instead, he stopped outside the door. Inside and outside the door. Inside and behind the wall. The little fellow seemed to have noticed something. She tilted her head and glanced at Chen-Shi, only to find that her father's lips were tightly pursed. He seemed to be a little nervous. So she wrapped her arms around Chen-Shi's neck and slowly pressed her ear against Chen-Shi's chest, as if she wanted to hear his heartbeat. Chen-Shi didn't hesitate too much. He waved his arm gently, and the courtyard door opened automatically. Small courtyard pavilion. Stone table guqin. She was dressed in white, standing in the snow, looking up at the sky in a daze. The woman heard the movement and slowly turned her head to look at the courtyard door. Immediately after, the sorrow on her face turned into astonishment. But after a moment, those astonishment all turned into uncontrollable excitement and anger. She wanted to see that familiar face again, but the tears that she couldn't help blurred her eyes in the blink of an eye. Ying, I'm sorry. Chen-Shi held the little girl in her arms and strode towards her, shrinking the ground into an inch. In a flash, the little fellow curled up in Chen-Shi's arms. Although her face was a little timid, her big eyes were still staring straight at the woman in white in front of her. The woman didn't seem to be prepared. In the blink of an eye, Chen-Shi, who was standing outside the courtyard just now, appeared in front of her at this moment. This frightened her so much that she couldn't help but take a step back. Ying, it's me. I'm back. Chen-Shi held the little fellow in one hand and pulled her with the other. However, what he got in response was a resounding slap. Slap. The woman didn't speak. After glancing at him, she quickly lowered her head to look at the little fellow in his arms. The tears that had already welled up in her eyes suddenly gushed out crazily as if a dam had been opened. She no longer paid attention to Chen-Shi, but looked at the little guy in his arms. Nian, is that you? The woman looked at the little fellow in Chen-Shi's arms. When she saw the little fellow's cute little face, she couldn't help but smile as she cried. She stretched out her trembling hands, wanting to take the little fellow from Chen-Shi's arms. However, the little fellow shyly hugged Chen-Shi and twisted his body to avoid the woman's hand. That nervous and uneasy look was just like the first time Chen-Shi saw her. When the woman saw the little fellow's confused and nervous expression, she felt as if her heart had been ruthlessly stabbed by a knife. That heart-wrenching pain was almost unbearable. How can she be a mother if she doesn't raise her child? That was why her daughter was so unfamiliar with her when she was already so old. This was retribution. Seeing this, Chen-Shi hurriedly said to the little fellow, Nian, call me mommy. Do you remember what mommy looks like? Do you remember that you've been looking at family photos every day? Think about it. This is mommy. The little fellow clutched Chen-Shi's clothes tightly. She looked uneasily at the crying woman in front of her. She hesitated for a moment. Then she suddenly stretched out her little hand to the woman and said softly, Mommy. The woman was stunned, as if she couldn't believe her ears. Seeing this, the little fellow raised her voice and shouted again, Mommy, hug. The woman trembled and stretched out her hands again. And this time, the little fellow took the initiative to reach out her hands to her. She stiffly took the little fellow from Chen-Shi's arms. The little fellow wrapped her arms around her neck. Seeing that her tears were still flowing, she stretched out her little hand to wipe her face and said very sensibly, Mommy, don't cry. You won't be beautiful if you cry. The woman stared blankly at the little fellow, quietly feeling the warmth from her hands, but her tears still fell uncontrollably. The little fellow wiped her tears. Seeing that she was still crying, she wrapped her arms around her neck and leaned on her body, saying softly, Mommy is a great beauty. Don't cry. You won't be beautiful if you cry. If Mommy isn't beautiful, I won't be beautiful when I grow up. The child was so sensible. The woman suddenly broke down. She hugged the little fellow tightly and slowly squatted on the ground. Her crying was so heart-wrenching, as if she was a Xianglin sister-in-law whose child was taken away by a wolf. It was so sad that it could break one's heart. The little fellow was very sensible. She hugged the woman and comforted her. "Mommy, don't cry, don't cry." As she spoke, she used her little hand to gently pat the woman's back. Chun-Shi stood silently by the side, looking at his lover's crying appearance. He couldn't help but have mixed feelings. Time had faded her immaturity and draped her with a trace of vicissitudes of life. He couldn't avoid that slap. Qin Ruoying. Qing Ruoying. Perhaps the little fellow's comforting words were effective. The woman gradually stopped crying. After calming herself down, she gently let go of the little fellow. Then, she held her hand and stood up again. Her eyes were slightly red. And when she looked at the little fellow, her eyes were filled with love. But when she looked at Chun-Shi, her gaze became very complicated. After hesitating for a moment, she said softly, "Why do you want to leave?" Her voice was very soft, and it sounded as if there were no emotions. Chun-Shi's heart immediately rose to his throat. After hesitating for a moment, Chun-Shi suddenly formed a seal, then lightly tapped the woman's forehead. The woman was stunned. Then the huge amount of memories crazily rushed into her mind like a tide. Heavenly Jade World. Heavenly Yen Divine Sect. Servant Disciple. Chun-Shi at that time. Hesitation, struggle, helplessness, loss, but most of all, pain. It seemed like a simple move, but because Chun-Shi forcefully used his soul, he immediately suffered a backlash, and he couldn't help but let out a muffled groan. After hearing Chun-Shi's groan, Qin Ruoying immediately reacted and hurriedly shouted, "That's enough." Seeing him in pain, she couldn't help but cry anxiously. Chun-Shi's first few years of memories in Heavenly Jade World also made her finally understand. What exactly had he experienced all these years? "I miss you so much." Qin Ruoying threw herself into Chun-Shi's arms, then leaned her head on his chest, and tears fell like rain. Chun-Shi gently hugged her. She raised her head and looked at Chun-Shi's face, which had become much paler in an instant, and couldn't help but murmur, "Do you know? After you left, I made a wish." Hearing this, Chun-Shi could only endure the pain caused by using his soul, and reluctantly asked, "What wish?" "I wish that after leaving for half your life, you'll return as a young man." Her gaze was as clear as that day on Middle Mountain Road. There were tears at the corners of her eyes, but she suddenly smiled. Yingying's smile was charming. Seeing this, Chun-Shi smiled with her. It was as if he had returned to the summer when he mustered the courage to confess his love. "Everything is as you wish." With that, Chun-Shi gently pulled Qin Ruoying into his arms. He lowered his head and gently kissed those two slightly cold red lips. This kiss was 5 years apart. This kiss was 500 years apart. "From now on, I only wish to be with you for the rest of my life." Qin Xueqing stood outside the courtyard, not daring to enter. When she saw the two of them kissing, she seemed to finally understand something. 2 lines of clear tears kept falling down her cheeks, but the corners of her mouth raised slightly. But at this moment an angry voice suddenly sounded. "Yuanqing, what are you doing?" The smile on Qin Xueqing's face immediately disappeared. She retreated to the courtyard, somewhat afraid. And this also alarmed the two of them who were having an intimate moment in the courtyard. Seeing this, Qin Ruoying suddenly remembered something, and hurriedly pulled Chun-Shi to the house next door. "Quick, take Nian and leave first." At this moment, her face was full of panic, and there was no trace of happiness and sweetness on her face. However, at this moment, Chun-Shi gently held her hand and said very gently, "Don't be afraid, I'm here." Qin Ruoying still wanted to say something, but Chun-Shi pulled her into his arms and blocked her words with his mouth. "Papa, you're shameless." "Shame, shame, shame." The little fellow was held by Qin Ruoying. As soon as she saw Chun-Shi kissing her again, she immediately giggled excitedly. "Are you crazy? Why are you still here?" Qin Xueqing suddenly rushed over and tried to push Chun-Shi away, but before she could get close, she had been restrained by Chun-Shi again. Then, Chun-Shi gently let go of Qin Ruoying, and then asked very seriously, "Since I'm here, I must take you home today." Ying, do you believe me? Qin Ruoying was stunned for a moment. However, she quickly nodded her head and replied solemnly, I believe you. Chen Shi gently touched her face, and then bent down to pick up the little fellow. He held the little fellow in his left hand, and held Qin Ruoying in his right hand. The family of three faced the gate of the courtyard like this. There were more and more people outside the courtyard. In the end, even an old man with white hair and beard was alarmed. As soon as the old man walked into the courtyard, he saw Chen Shi's unfamiliar face. And when he saw the little fellow in Chen Shi's arms, he couldn't help but change his expression greatly. He pointed at the little fellow and scolded sternly, Who is she? Chen Shi silently looked at everyone in front of him. Finally, his eyes stopped on the old man. Then he turned to the big cat and said, Big cat. The big cat had been squatting nearby and watching the fun. After hearing Chen Shi's voice, it immediately jumped out and responded with a meow. Get the carriage, meow? The big cat tilted its head, as if it didn't understand. Let's go home. His voice was as loud as a bell and as loud as thunder. The negative emotions that had accumulated for more than 500 years finally broke out at this moment. This is the last chapter before the release. The next chapter will be released on January 1st, 2018 at 5 o'clock. After the female lead comes out, I think I still have a conscience. It's still the same sentence. Don't force people to donate monthly votes, and let fate decide. Everyone has a difficult time. If you have money, you can help others, but if you don't, you can help others. Friends who watch pirated versions, remember to come back and give me 2 recommendation votes. It's a kind of support. As for those who don't have anything and still want to talk nonsense after watching it for free, forget it, I won't say it. This chapter's BGM. The Snow Between the Eyebrows Swordnet San's love song was changed into an official video by Swordnet San. Countless people cried after listening to it. I strongly recommend you to listen to the story version, not the pure song version. And I'm in Shuangming Town, my name is West Window White Pure Yang. But I miss you, it's useless to know. Not throwing you away, but finding you in dreams. After waking up, I'm on the balcony with dreams. West Window White, the cold moon, a yard full of snow. The first chapter. The sword has not been properly equipped, but I'm already in Jianghu. And the second chapter. The wine is still warm, but I don't know the universe. To be continued. Chapter 109. It's up. Let's not talk about empty words. I'm trying my best to write as much as I can. I've saved a chapter and a half and will publish it after midnight. Anyway, I'll just write as much as I can today. I won't compete with others because I really can't write. There's only one sentence. I can't give you the quantity, but I can give you the quality. So I hope you can give me your support and understanding, okay? For example, come and spend a dime to give me a first order? That's not too much. Thank you for your support, especially those who supported the original version. And every single one of them who had tipped and supported. Heart to heart. I'll say the same thing. I don't mind pirated readers, but I'll try my best to encourage you to read the original version. Those who have money will support me, and those who don't will support me. Everyone has their difficulties, so I won't reject pirated readers. I won't open an anti-piracy website. I won't sell myself as poor or miserable, because I've been writing novels for more than 10 years. Except for this one, I haven't even earned back the courier fees for the others. If I don't find a job, I'm afraid I'll starve to death. Well, I've opened a takeaway shop before, so I know a lot about takeaway. So I don't understand what some authors are thinking. They can't even afford to eat, so why don't they go out to work? If they go out to work and improve themselves in society, the things they write should be better than writing behind closed doors, right? Anyway, that's how I got through. Once this book is up, I should be able to get rid of the title of flop. Thank you, all of you. Without you, I wouldn't be able to make a comeback today. You've also made me feel what it means to be pushed to the top. In 2005, I started my first book on Qidian. I wrote more than 100,000 words, but I didn't sign a contract. For the past 12 years, I'll write and submit when I'm free to see if I can sign a contract. The first time I signed a contract was in 2010. The longest book was more than 700,000 words. There were 2 subscriptions and each of them was 13. Xuanhuan, fantasy, xianxia, sci-fi, urban, supernatural, including female genre and countless subcategories. I've written about everything except history and military affairs, which I haven't really written about yet. They all flopped. This book was also the first time I was pushed to the top by Sanjiang. I just want to encourage all of you. Please believe that God won't let you down. Your hard work today will pay off one day. It may be late, but it will never be absent. Let's talk about this book. I want to write a book that you will still talk about years later. No matter how many flaws it has, it is a work that I have put my heart and soul into. To be honest, I've already written so much that I've cried several times. What he had written had moved him to tears. Thinking about it, it was really strange. A lot of readers, actually, they're just posers, after reading the first chapter, scolded me for writing old-fashioned stuff, and started scolding me after reading 10 lines at a glance. To be honest, they might look down on my first chapter and think that my first chapter is very old-fashioned. But in fact, when I finished the first chapter, I had already cried. At that time, I had a very strange feeling. I was neither happy nor sad. There were clearly no fluctuations in my emotions, but I still shed tears. And that was only when I was writing the first chapter. Later, when I reached chapter 40, I cried again. At chapter 45, I also cried. However, many people praised chapter 55, saying that it was the highest quality chapter, but I didn't have any reaction. There were a few chapters after that. There were tears, but it wasn't enough. Until chapter 93. I was stuck at chapter 93 for a long time. But when I wrote the last paragraph, I shed tears again. If an author can write until they cry, I feel that I have succeeded. If it was an old author or an old reader, when they saw the title of my book, they could already come to a conclusion. This book has too many restrictions. Because the core of cultivation and stay-at-home dad are conflicting. One is to train and fight monsters, the other is to live a warm life. Also, the timeline of stay-at-home dad novels is very short, but the timeline of cultivation is thousands of years. To be able to write such a result was something that I didn't expect at all. So I didn't save any chapters. Every chapter was written and published on the spot. To be able to write and publish on the spot to reach this level, I'm actually very satisfied. If it wasn't serialized, I think I could write even better. Chapter 107, I'm very satisfied. I hope you leave for half your life and return as a teenager. I didn't dawdle for half a day in vain. From the perspective of making money, Chapter 107 shouldn't be a free chapter. If I were to open another book, I would definitely save 200,000 before publishing it. It's too difficult to not save any chapters. Let's talk about the update. I hope you can understand. I also want to write more, but I really can't do it. It's not that I'm not working hard, but I've already tried my best. To say something arrogant, I feel that the quality of my book is okay. For example, in chapter 97, when Ning Zhongguo called, I could actually choose to open a branch here and expand it into a complete set of pretentious face-slapping scenes. But I have other plots in my mind. I think the plots in my mind are more meaningful than these face-slapping scenes, so I don't want to write that. This also causes me to write very slowly, because I write every chapter very carefully, racking my brain to think about it. Even if it's a confirmed plot, I will repeatedly think about it, because I'm afraid I can't control it. My way of writing also causes a lot of people to just skim through it. They might not even notice some details. Of course, even if you skip some of the key things that I think are the starting point, it won't affect the subsequent reading. This is the charm of online literature. If it's not good, I'll skip it. There will always be something I like. If there's really nothing that attracts me, okay, I'll abandon the book. I'm not an illiterate. I used to write brainless novels. But now, since I've chosen this topic, I have to write it properly. It's really hard to write, much harder than routine novels. So, I'd rather write the background setting that you don't want to see the most, rather than write these small branches. I hope you can understand my thoughts. Please forgive me. 2 chapters a day, try to keep it up. If you can write more, then add more. In any case, it's a serious promotion. In order to cherish this opportunity, I'll nag a bit more. Actually, I really didn't ask for recommendation tickets, rewards, or anything like that. So I'm very sorry for Jejia and everyone's rewards. Other people have to add more chapters for rewards, but I don't have anything here, so I don't dare to ask for rewards or recommendations. It's not that I don't want to, it's that I don't dare. Because I don't have a way to add more chapters. Sorry. I'm very grateful for everyone's support, especially those who have been voting since I started writing tens of thousands of words. There are more and more voting IDs. I can actually see a few familiar ones. It's really deep. I was a failure in the past, so monthly votes are a very distant thing to me. So even if I've been in a fight before, I've never cared about it. I don't dare to think about it. I'm a failure. Why think so much? The monthly votes are for me to play with. Because I'm too calm even after achieving today's results, I still feel like I'm living in a dream. In the past, when I slept, there was still no change in my collection. But now, in the blink of an eye, my collection has increased again. It's all thanks to everyone's support that I can achieve today's results. Thank you. I may focus on different things from other authors. I prefer to pay attention to the readers' comments. So you often see me in the comments section, or when I open a chapter. I don't care too much about the results, but I care a lot about your comments. So when I see some people deliberately belittling my hard work, I get very angry. Especially those who say that it's highly toxic and has already been appraised. I'm really speechless. But I care a lot about the readers' comments, so I often get angry. One last thing. I'm a pure newbie author. I don't have any achievements from previous books, and I'm writing alone. I don't have any support from old readers. I don't have any author friends, and I don't have any data. My updates are so weak. But I can reach 50,000 favorites at Chidian with 200,000 words. How many are there? Some idiots say that I'm manipulating data. They don't know, but they pretend to know. The number of subscribers, the number of fans, these are all roughly proportional. Whether I'm manipulating or not, any old author will be able to tell at a glance. I have such good results. Why do I need to manipulate my results to court death? Use your poor brain. Since my first recommendation, I've always been the first in the category of new books, category strong recommendation, 6 bands, 3 rivers, bookshelves strong recommendation. When have I ever lost? I don't have many recommendations because I'm a newbie and it's a city category. So it's hard to get a recommendation, and the editor didn't give me any extra recommendations. So, thank you for your support, brothers. Without you, I wouldn't have achieved today's results. Thank you for giving a failure for more than 10 years a chance to make a comeback. Thank you. December 31st, 2017. Yours truly. Happy New Year. I hope that in the coming year, you and I will still be side by side. VIP Book Group, 517861243. Chapter 110. A lot of people suddenly poured into the yard. These people were either men or women, old or young. They stood near the gate of the yard, looking at the family of 3 in the yard with unkind expressions. An old man with white hair and beard pushed the crowd out. When he saw Chun-Shi holding the child in one hand and holding Qin Ruoying in the other, he was so angry that even his beard trembled. The old man's eyes flashed with a trace of fierceness. He pointed at the little fellow and said angrily, "Who is she?" In fact, did he still need to ask? So no one answered his question. Chun-Shi held Qin Ruoying's hand. He felt that Yingying's hand was a little cold. So he gently squeezed her hand, indicating that she should not be afraid. Although encouraged by Chun-Shi, Qin Ruoying still did not dare to look at the old man directly. She lowered her head slightly and bit her lips tightly. She seemed to be a little scared. After the old man finished asking, he kept staring at Qin Ruoying. However, Qin Ruoying did not dare to look at him at all. This also made the old man so angry that his beard trembled. When he pointed at Qin Ruoying and was about to scold her, Chun-Shi suddenly turned to the big cat and said, "Big cat, get the carriage. Let's go home." His voice was as loud as a bell and as loud as thunder. The big cat heard the voice and got up. It immediately jumped to Chun-Shi's side, and its body expanded rapidly. The deep cloud ink leopard showed its fangs. This sudden change also startled the old man, and a trace of surprise appeared on his face. He looked at the big cat and said with some surprise, "Monster? The big cat suddenly changed back to its original form, and many people at the gate of the yard were frightened. Some people even immediately left the yard. However, the old man was only stunned for a moment. Then, he suddenly burst out laughing. Our village has never had a mountain guardian spirit beast. This old man has been traveling for more than 10 years, but still couldn't find one. I didn't expect that today. I would find it so easily. The big cat crouched beside Chen-Shi's feet and assumed a pouncing posture. This old man made it very unhappy, so it immediately roared at the old man. Meow! The old man laughed and took a step forward. But at this time, a figure suddenly flew over from the mountain. After a few twists and turns, the figure suddenly appeared in the open space in the center of the courtyard. This was a middle-aged man who looked to be in his 40s. His temperament was refined, and he had a scholarly air about him. Third uncle. After the man arrived, he respectfully bowed to the old man. The old man glanced at him with some displeasure, but he still stopped. He flicked his sleeve and scolded. Look at your good daughter. Hearing this, the middle-aged man slowly turned around and looked at Chen-Shi. After seeing him turn around, Qin Ruoying couldn't help but shout nervously, Dad! The man was Qin Yongyan. Qin Yongyan silently looked at Qin Ruoying, and then looked at Chen-Shi. Finally, his eyes fell on the little fellow in Chen-Shi's arms. The little fellow was lying in Chen-Shi's arms. Seeing Qin Yongyan looking at her, the little fellow was embarrassed and hid her little face in Chen-Shi's arms. There were too many people here, and the little fellow had learned to be afraid of strangers. Qin Yongyan was silent for a long time. Then he sighed deeply, looked at Qin Ruoying with a complicated expression, and asked softly, Ying, is this your child? How old is she? Qin Ruoying didn't speak. Chen-Shi smiled and said, 4.5 years old. She will be 5 years old in summer. Qin Yongyan couldn't help shaking his head when he heard this. He seemed to be deeply moved as he sighed faintly, so I'm already a grandfather. The grandfather and granddaughter met for the first time under such circumstances. The old man called third uncle was obviously not interested in seeing their family reunion, so he shouted again. Qin Yongyan, let me ask you, Xian Nu had an affair with another man and gave birth to a bastard child. According to the ancestral rules, how should we punish her? Qin Yongyan was stunned. He didn't turn around. Instead, he looked at Qin Ruoying and said in a low voice with a pained expression, Fire. Then why are you still standing there? Take them down. Qin Yongyan stood there with a complicated expression on his face. Qin Ruoying couldn't help crying when she saw him like this. She murmured sadly, Dad, I'm sorry. As she spoke, she wanted to break free from Chen-Shi's hand and rush over. However, Chen-Shi held her tightly, ready to see Qin Yongyan's reaction. Although the person in front of him was his father-in-law. However, if he wanted to push Ying into the fire pit, then don't blame Chen-Shi for being ruthless. Qin Yongyan didn't respond. Third uncle waited for a while, but he still didn't move. He was so angry that he laughed and said, What? You can't do it? Qin Yongyan still didn't answer. Third uncle was furious when he saw this. He immediately shouted to the crowd behind him, Xinghuai, Hian, take down this adulterous couple and that bastard child. As soon as he finished speaking, 2 figures suddenly rushed out from the crowd. Old Qin, third uncle has given the order. Sorry to offend you. Zhao Xinghuai, Li Hoan, and Qin Yongyan. The 3 of them were the best of their generation, and it was hard to tell who was the better one. The stranger in front of them was obviously Qin Yongyan's son-in-law, and the girl was his granddaughter. Zhao Xinghuai and Li Hin were not willing to participate in these trivial matters, but under the old man's orders, they had no choice but to act and capture this stranger who had suddenly intruded. The 2 of them jumped out of the crowd and went straight to Chen-Shi. However, Qin Yongyan suddenly turned around and stood in front of them. Then he directly hit Zhao Xinghuai's back with his palm. Old Qin Yu. Zhao Xinghuai didn't expect that Qin Yongyan would dare to attack him in this situation. He was caught off guard and had to take the hit. Li Hoan saw this and immediately supported Zhao Xinghuai. Then he started to fight with Qin Yongyan. The 3 of them were suddenly in a mess. Chen-Shi saw this and immediately said to the big cat, Big cat, go and help him. Meow. The big cat joined the fight. Li Hoan was forced to turn around and fight, which immediately relieved the pressure on Qin Yongyan. The big cat was a monster in the awakening realm, which was equivalent to the foundation establishment stage of cultivators. However, Li Hoan could fight with the big cat without being at a disadvantage. This also allowed Chun Shi to have the most direct judgment of their strength. Third uncle looked at the three of them with a gloomy face, but he didn't say anything to stop them. At this time, Chun Shi suddenly let go of Qin Ruoying's hand. He gently pinched the little girl's face, and then very gently handed the little girl to Qin Ruoying. The little girl was still a little unfamiliar with her mother, so she immediately grabbed Chun Shi and asked nervously, "Papa, what are you going to do?" "Papa is going to reason with them." "Good girl, you go to Mama." "Oh." The little girl nodded blankly. It was unknown whether she understood or not. Looking at the three of them suddenly fighting in front of her, the little girl thought that they were dancing. She tilted her head and thought for a while. She opened her mouth and was about to say something. However, Chun Shi suddenly used a meditation spell on the little girl's forehead. The little girl fell into a deep sleep. "Good girl, go to sleep. When you wake up, we will be home." Chun Shi gently touched her little face and then touched Qin Ruoying's face. Qin Ruoying held his hand, and her face was full of worry. But at this time, Chun Shi said to her with a smile, "I'll take you home." Qin Ruoying was stunned. "Yes." She nodded heavily and hugged the little guy in her arms even tighter. Chun Shi took back his hand, turned around and took a step forward. Behind him, it was his wife and child, and his sister-in-law who couldn't speak or move, and could only be anxious. In front of him, it was a group of strangers led by the old man. The old man looked at him, and was about to ask someone to take him down. Chun Shi suddenly opened his mouth and said two words softly. "Sword, come." He raised his right hand and grasped in the air. The wind and snow all over the sky seemed to hear his call. Like a dragon dancing, the wind and snow came with great momentum. The snow floated to Chun Shi's hand and instantly condensed into ice. In the blink of an eye, a 3-foot-long sword condensed by ice appeared in his hand. With the sound of a sword, the wind and snow came. "I stand with a sword. With frost and snow as my sword, I dare to be the enemy of the world. I give you quality, and you give me support and understanding, okay?" Chapter 111. A sword rang out. A long sword made of frost and snow appeared in Chun Shi's hand. The blade was as thin as a cicada's wing. It could take a life with a light stroke. However, the sword was made of ice. In terms of hardness, it was not even comparable to glass. It could shatter into pieces with a casual touch. However, when the sword appeared, third uncle's expression changed abruptly. His old face was filled with shock. "Divine arts. You've already stepped into the heavenly master realm at such a young age." A martial artist who sat on his crotch was called a grandmaster. A necromancer who had divine arts was called a heavenly master. Both of them were titles, but the meaning they represented was completely different from one another. The great Tao was like mercury flowing down the ground. No matter which path one took, they would reach the same end in the end. Therefore, if the two were compared, a heavenly master was in existence 2 whole realms higher than a grandmaster. Third uncle sized up Chun Shi with surprise and uncertainty. No matter how he looked at him, this man was about the same age as Qin Ruoying. However, he was actually an illuminating god necromancer. Third uncle was still in shock and uncertainty. However, Chun Shi took another step forward and shouted coldly, "Who's coming? Who's coming? Who dares to come?" He stood proudly with his sword. With frost and snow as his sword, his aura suddenly rose. It was as if an ordinary young man had suddenly become a peerless swordsman who looked down on the world. A cyclone suddenly appeared in the sky above the courtyard. The wind and snow were also expelled from the courtyard by that invisible cyclone. Even the snow stopped falling in this courtyard. The martial Tao was about aura. When facing an enemy, if you lost your aura, you had already lost by 3 points. Chun Shi's aura was so strong that it was overbearing. Third uncle, on the other hand, couldn't figure out his background. However, the old man was very cunning. Since he could not figure out his background, he immediately looked behind him. He did not say anything. A middle-aged man immediately walked out. This middle-aged man was muscular, and only wore a single shirt in the middle of winter. After walking out of the crowd, he spat on the ground and said disdainfully, "How dare you be so impudent here, you?" However, before he could finish his sentence, Chunshi interrupted him. Without even looking at the man, he coldly said, "You're not worthy." The man was taken aback. He was so angry that his entire face was distorted. But at this time, Chunshi suddenly waved his arm, and an invisible force suddenly shot out. The man immediately spat out a mouthful of blood, and was sent flying. "Zhao Laosi, are you okay?" If the person behind him hadn't caught him in time, he would have fallen heavily to the ground. Zhao Laosi kept spitting out blood and couldn't say a word. From the looks of it, he must have suffered severe internal injuries. Take him to Miracle Dr. Wang. Third uncle only glanced at Zhao Laosi, then turned his head to look at Chunshi. At this moment, his expression finally became serious. "Who's next?" Chunshi took another step forward and said coldly. Although his words were directed at everyone in the courtyard, his gaze was on third uncle. Under normal circumstances, Chunshi wouldn't use a sword. The reason why he took the sword before the battle today was to seize the opportunity for himself. This old man wasn't simple. This village was full of hidden dragons and crouching tigers. Chunshi was proud, but not arrogant. Those below the Golden Core realm were ants. But if a few Golden Core realm cultivators really appeared, it would be troublesome. After all, he was still severely injured and had yet to recover. Moreover, his wife and children were here. Once he struck, he would kill until they were terrified. Chunshi held his sword and walked slowly in the direction of the courtyard. Some of the weaker cultivators immediately ran out of the courtyard when they saw that the situation wasn't good. "Young man, you're so spirited." Third uncle finally spoke. He chuckled and looked at Chunshi thoughtfully. Then he shook his head and sighed. "Fine, let this old man fight you." As soon as he finished speaking, third uncle suddenly attacked. Energy surged all over his body, and he suddenly slapped his palm toward Chunshi. His palm was like a rainbow piercing through the sun, aiming directly at Chunshi's head. Third uncle's action was no different from a sneak attack, which was despised by others. The reason why he did this was because he wasn't completely confident that he could defeat Chunshi. It could only be said that Chunshi's performance was too strong, so he didn't dare to be arrogant in front of Chunshi. "Chunshi, watch out." Just as third uncle attacked, Qin Shiweching, who had been released by Chunshi, suddenly shouted, "Third uncle has already cultivated the supreme force. He's above the master realm." However, third uncle's movements were extremely fast. As soon as she spoke, third uncle had already slapped toward Chunshi's head. He chose a very clever position. He was standing in front and left of Chunshi. Chunshi was holding a sword in his right hand, and his left side was wide open, full of flaws. Looking at Chunshi, who was so close to him, a cold light flashed in third uncle's eyes. He could even imagine what kind of scene would occur after this palm strike. "A Taoist master? Within 10 steps, I'll kill you like killing a chicken." Third uncle's eyes flashed with a trace of fierceness. He was not a kind man. So after this attack, he didn't think of holding back at all. But at this moment, Chunshi suddenly disappeared in front of him. Third uncle was stunned and could no longer maintain his calmness. His expression changed greatly. Like an old crane flapping its wings, he immediately tried to escape. However, how could Chunshi let him go? His sword moved according to his will, and the long sword made of frost and snow suddenly pierced third uncle's chest. The first move of the moonlight sword technique. One move, hidden void. Before the sword was out, the sword chi returned to 1, hidden and not released. As soon as the sword momentum was released, in an instant, it was like a long river hanging upside down, soaring into the sky. The tip of the sword first pierced through third uncle's protective shield, which could only be condensed by a martial artist in the gang realm. The so-called impenetrable protective shield was like a glass cover at this moment, and was immediately pierced by Chunshi's sword tip. In the blink of an eye, it turned into white gas and dissipated in all directions. Third uncle retreated quickly. He was even faster than when he came, and in the blink of an eye, He had already rushed out of the courtyard. Escape. This person was too terrifying. Unfortunately, that sword was even faster. One move hidden void. As soon as the sword move was released, it would return after drinking blood. Third uncle was still in midair, but Chun-Chi's sword seemed to turn into a ray of light, directly shooting toward third uncle's back. Puff! The sword chi went straight into third uncle's flesh, and his body exploded into a cloud of blood. Then, like a wild goose that was shot by a hunter, he fell heavily to the bottom of the hill. There was a dead silence. Even Qin Ruoying was frightened by Chun-Chi's killing intent, and could not help but reach out to grab his clothes. No wonder he wanted Nian Nian to sleep. It turned out that he was going to kill third uncle. A few of the smarter ones immediately reacted, shouting third uncle's name, and rushed out to look for him. This change came too suddenly. The two people who were fighting Qin Yongyan and Big Cat immediately jumped out of the battle, and retreated directly to the courtyard door. Big Cat wanted to chase after them, but Chun-Chi stopped him in time. Big Cat, come back. Meow. Qin Yongyan stared at his cheap son-in-law in front of him, dumbfounded. That was third uncle, and Gang Realm great-grandmaster. He could not even take one move of his sword. Chun-Chi did not notice his father-in-law's expression. Chapter 112. In fact, Chun-Chi didn't want to kill them all. He wanted to kill them until they were terrified. What bullsh *t ancestral behest? What bullsh *t? Burning Ying with a gun? Then I'll burn all of you first. At this moment, the murderous look in Chun-Chi's eyes was enough to make people retreat 3 feet away. After he hit third uncle with his sword, the group of people in the courtyard who were watching the show all left the courtyard. They came quickly and retreated even faster. Chun-Chi didn't stop at all. He took another step forward and shouted coldly, "Who else?" He glanced at everyone who dared to show their faces. Everyone who made eye contact with him would quickly look away. They didn't dare to look at him for more than a second. Even Zhao Xinghuai and Li Hoan, who were fighting with Qin Yongyan, had retreated to the entrance of the courtyard. They guarded the entrance nervously. Third uncle couldn't even take one move from him. No one dared to stand up. Chun-Chi waited for a while. Seeing that they were all afraid, he held Ying-Ying's hand again and said gently to her, "Let's go home." For simple words. However, it made Qin Ruoying cry again at this moment. She looked at the strange yet familiar man in front of her. A sense of security instantly filled her heart. 20 years ago, that subconscious choice. That's right. Chun-Chi held the sword in one hand, and Ying-Ying in the other. He was going to take her home. On their way home, he would kill anyone who stood in his way. He would kill anyone who stood in his way. However, just as Chun-Chi's aura was at its peak, an old voice suddenly came from the sky. Yes, it came from the sky. "Young man, since you're already a heavenly master, why are you so angry? I've seen a heavenly master before." His temperament was also impressive. This voice seemed to be everywhere, penetrating every nook and cranny. After hearing this voice, the people outside the courtyard were shocked. They kept turning their heads to look for the source of the voice. Hearing this, Chun-Chi couldn't help but snort angrily. He gently squeezed Ying-Ying's soft hand, then let go of her hand. "Stop pretending to be mysterious. Kill the young and the old will come." Chun-Chi took another step forward and protected Ying-Ying behind him. Then he raised his head slightly and looked in the direction of the ancestral hall. Then Chun-Chi suddenly looked up to the sky and roared, "Since you want to fight, come out. Come at me together, so that I don't waste my time." In that instant, his voice was like the roar of a lion, exploding with thunder. The people outside the courtyard were so shocked that their ears were ringing. They couldn't help but cover their ears. Some of them couldn't stand it, and immediately squatted on the ground and screamed in pain. However, the Qin's family in the courtyard didn't feel anything. Qin Wanqing even found it strange. What was wrong with the people outside the courtyard? A burst of laughter suddenly sounded. The person hadn't arrived yet, but his appearance could already be heard from his voice. He was like an old and kind grandfather looking at his naughty grandson. His eyes were full of a kind and doting feeling. "Young man, You're so arrogant." As soon as he finished speaking, a figure suddenly appeared in the sky above the ancestral hall. It was an old man in white training clothes. He looked old and clumsy, leaning on an elm walking stick. He slowly walked in the direction of the courtyard. Yes, he was walking. However, he was walking in the air at an altitude of 40 to 50 meters. That's great-granduncle. Zhao Xinghuai stared at the old man in a daze. After rubbing his eyes hard, he suddenly knelt down and shouted, "Greetings to great-granduncle." As soon as he said that, everyone outside the courtyard knelt on the ground and shouted, "Greetings to great-granduncle." Great-granduncle was the village's legend. No one knew exactly how old great-granduncle was, and no one knew exactly how high his seniority was. That was why even third uncle could only call him great-granduncle. Great-granduncle hadn't appeared for decades. So many people thought that he had passed away. They didn't expect to see great-granduncle again today. Chen Shi's brows furrowed slightly. He felt very uncomfortable, because he couldn't stand this kind of old bastard who was still unwilling to turn into dust despite the decadent feudal tradition. "I don't care what Elysium or Xiannu you are. If you want to burn Yingying to death, then you're going against me." Thinking of this, Chen Shi couldn't help but snort angrily. Then he picked up his sword and walked towards the old man step by step. It was as if he was playing in Mount Tai. With every step Chen Shi took, it was as if he was stepping on a new level. However, there was nothing under his feet. He was walking in the air. He was ascending to the sky. Grand Elder Gongzheng greeted the juniors outside the courtyard with a smile. When he saw Chen Shi walking in the air from the courtyard, the kind smile on his face slowly disappeared. "Celestial being?" Great-granduncle leaned on his walking stick and couldn't help but ask in surprise. "You've already become a celestial being?" Above the celestial master level was the condensing pill. Only after the condensing pill could one become a celestial being. Chen Shi walked in the air and stood in front of great-granduncle. One was old and one was young. One was holding a sword, and the other was leaning on a walking stick. They just stood in the air. Chen Shi acted as if he didn't hear great-granduncle's exclamation. Instead he asked, "I only have one question." Great-granduncle took a deep look at him, then laughed and said, "Please go ahead." Chen Shi's current state had forced him to put this young man in the same position as himself. Hearing this, Chen Shi suddenly laughed. "You beat the young one, and the old one comes. Why don't you come together? Do you have anyone above you? If you do, just call them out. I'm in a hurry." After that, Chen Shi stood with his hands behind his back and the tip of his sword slanted. Frost and snow as a sword, shining brightly. Great-granduncle didn't say anything. At this moment, his eyes became a little gloomy. Since third uncle came in, Chen Shi's momentum had been rising. Before the fight, great-granduncle already had a trace of fear in his heart. That was momentum. Winning with momentum, winning before the fight. This young man was really terrifying. Great-granduncle looked at Chen Shi expressionlessly, as if he was thinking about something. After thinking for a while, he suddenly chuckled. "Young man, it's good to have spirit. But have you ever thought that if you lose today, even if you only lose by one move, what will happen to you, your wife, and your children?" How vicious this old bastard was. After hearing this, even with Chen Shi's self-confidence and composure, he couldn't help but look back at his wife and children in the courtyard. Almost without any hesitation, he raised his left hand and grabbed in the air. The wind and snow suddenly became stronger. In just a moment, hundreds of frost swords condensed around him. Chen Shi waved his left hand. The densely packed frost swords suddenly flew towards Qin Ruoying, who was in the courtyard. Buzz! The long swords broke through the ground, bringing with them a burst of crisp sounds. With Qin Ruoying as the center, the dense frost swords were inserted into the ground one after another. Chapter 113. Frost and snow were the swords, and the swords were the array. Hundreds of frost swords were densely inserted into the ground, surrounding Qin Ruoying, who was holding the little fellow. If one looked from the sky, one would find that these swords were not randomly inserted. The position of each frost sword contained a certain truth of heaven and earth. Qin Yongyan was his father-in-law, and Qin Xueqing was his sister-in-law. These were all people closely related to Yingying, so Qinshi conveniently included them. In this big village, Yingying seemed to have only 2 relatives left. Setting up an array required distraction. And this was actually the real purpose of great-granduncle. Would he really be so kind as to remind Qinshi to protect his wife and child? Obviously not. Great-granduncle was just breaking Qinshi's momentum. He grasped the lifeline and broke the momentum with one word. Even a snake should be hit where it hurts, let alone a person. In great-granduncle's eyes, Qinshi came leisurely in the sky with a shocking sword momentum. Qinshi's own momentum had reached the realm of perfection. Just like Shimin Chueshua on the top of the Forbidden City, one man with one sword, his momentum was natural. But Qinshi was not Shimin Chueshua after all. He was more like Yi Guqing with a fatal weakness. That was Yingying and Yinyan. Great-granduncle cleverly grasped Qinshi's weakness. So he broke his momentum. Great-granduncle couldn't figure out Qinshi's realm. But that was not important. If the winner could be decided only by the realm, then what was the point of fighting? They could just compete with whose realm was higher. A lion would use all its strength to hunt a rabbit. If a warrior at the peak of obvious strength used the right method, he might be able to kill a warrior at peak strength. That was martial arts. In a battle between masters, the winner could be seen in an instant. So when Qinshi was distracted to set up a defensive array for Qin Ruoying, great-granduncle took action. He suddenly grabbed his walking stick and swung it at Qinshi. This dragon-headed walking stick was his weapon. With the support of granduncle's strength, the dragon head at the top of the crutch seemed to come alive. It was like a dormant black dragon had suddenly woken up. Wrapped in a streak of white light, it suddenly blasted toward Qinshi with shocking power. Hibernating dragon, roaring 1,000 mountains. The clouds in the 8 directions moved, and the 4 directions surrendered. Granduncle's sneak attack was very sudden. Qinshi had turned around to set up the formation, and had not yet turned around. He struck out with his staff, aiming at the back of Qinshi's head. It was no different from Third Uncle's previous behavior. However, he was a little smarter than Third Uncle. He knew that he had to break the momentum and cause his opponent's mind to be disturbed before he made his move. However, no matter how astute great-granduncle was, he was still wrong about one thing. That was, he had underestimated Qinshi's strength. It was not an overestimation, but a far underestimation. The obvious strength stage could indeed kill the transforming strength stage. However, it was impossible for a golden core cultivator to kill a semi-god realm warrior. Even if he was just a semi-god realm warrior, who had not recovered from a serious injury. Therefore, just as the dragon-headed walking stick was about to hit Qinshi, a long sword suddenly appeared in front of Granduncle. Ding! The frost sword went from bottom to top. The seemingly fragile blade blocked Granduncle's dragon-headed walking stick. Because they were too close, Granduncle could even see every fine line on the frost sword. He widened his eyes. The energy in his body was surging, and his sleeves were fluttering. Just a little bit more. He would be able to break this frost sword soon. However, no matter how hard Granduncle tried, the frost sword was like a pillar holding up the sky, between him and Qinshi. At this time, Qinshi had finally finished setting up the formation. With the infusion of true essence, the blade of the frost sword suddenly burst out a strong golden light. He turned to look at Granduncle. "Since you are tired of living, I'll send you on your way." As soon as he finished speaking, Granduncle was shocked. He suddenly realized that a huge threat was coming. Seeing this, Granduncle immediately withdrew his dragon-headed walking stick, and then struck a pose. The dragon tail was entrenched, the dragon head was raised to the sky, and he held the walking stick in front of him with both hands. The guard technique, coiling dragon in the abyss, motionless as a mountain. And the moment he struck the pose, the tip of the sword condensed by frost and snow also stabbed toward him. A sword hidden in the air. Why did Qinshi use a sword? That was because the true essence he had accumulated was still too little. It could even be said that it was pitiful. He was like a professional landlord who had 10 million in cash, but chose to buy a house with all of it. After that, he lived by collecting rent. And he was just a beginner. Therefore, he had to be careful with his spending. He had to be calculative even when buying groceries. He didn't look like a multi-millionaire at all. Save money, buy a house, collect rent, save money, buy another house, collect more rent. This was a qualified professional landlord. The moonlight sword technique was comparable to the 49 styles of heaven divination. Although it didn't have many moves and had many limitations, it had an advantage that the 49 styles of heaven divination couldn't compare to. That was the sword technique consumed less true essence. And this was the fundamental reason why Grand Uncle could still jump in front of Chun-Shi until now. The long rainbow spirit, a sword hidden in the air. The sword light turned into a golden light and instantly blasted toward Grand Uncle. This sword was coming menacingly. Grand Uncle immediately clenched the dragon staff with both hands and roared, "Rise!" His words were the law. A black coiling dragon seemed to be substantial. It transformed into a roar and was about to pounce. Entering the Tao with martial arts, comprehending the truth of heaven and earth, and integrating the spiritual energy of heaven and earth. Grand Uncle was actually a rare peerless master in the world to have practiced martial arts to this level. But it was a pity. The person he met today was Chun-Shi, a person who belonged to this world, but also didn't belong to this world. Therefore, when the golden light hit the black dragon was immediately shaken to the point of almost falling. At the critical moment, Grand Uncle roared angrily. The primordial chi around him suddenly soared. This also made the black dragon, which should have been on the verge of falling, actually take shape again. He actually took this sword head-on. Chun-Shi looked at him with some surprise, but his hand movements didn't stop. Since he took one sword, let's take another. No. It should be 100 swords. The second move of the moonlight sword technique. 100 swords, no end. Chun-Shi raised his long sword and pointed at Grand Uncle from afar. A gust of cold wind that almost made people unable to open their eyes suddenly blew. In the wind and snow all over the sky, 100 frost swords condensed and took shape beside Chun-Shi one after another. Although the number wasn't as many as when he set up the array just now, each sword faintly glowed with golden light. 100 swords floated in the air, as if to illuminate the whole world. The man stood in the air, without any emotion in his eyes. This was the last scene that great-granduncle would see in his life. No, golden light bloomed. It was enough to wipe out some of the darkness in the world. After the 100 swords flew out, Chun-Shi turned around and flew back to the courtyard. He let go of the frost sword in his hand gently. The invincible divine sword turned back into the snowflakes all over the sky, sprinkling toward this small ancient village. Chun-Shi landed slowly by the side of Qin Ruoying. He reached out his hand and caressed her pretty face, which was a bit cold due to the wind and snow. He then took her hand slowly and said to her gently, "Let's go home." The initial subscriptions of this book have reached 13,000 so far. It will soon surpass The Path Toward Heaven and catch up with Mu Shen. Thank you, I love you. Chapter 114. The little fellow had a very, very long dream. In that dream, there were wonderful magical castles, lively and cute cartoon dolls, and colorful and brilliant magic. It was a very, very long dream. She wanted to ride the roller coaster, but Papa didn't take her. Sister Chang-Yi was the best. It was Sister Chang-Yi who took her to ride the roller coaster. There were many people riding the roller coaster. The little fellow had ridden it with Sister Chang-Yi several times, but she still hadn't gotten tired of it. Where's Papa? The little fellow suddenly thought of Papa, so she sat on the roller coaster and looked around for Papa. Nian Nian. Daddy is here. The little fellow looked in the direction of the voice, and suddenly saw her father flying in the sky and greeting her. Papa. She immediately jumped up excitedly and threw herself into her father's arms. Daddy will take you to the sky to pick the stars, okay? Okay. She sat in her father's arms and looked at the roller coaster below her getting smaller and smaller. It flew higher and higher, but she didn't feel afraid at all. Suddenly, a white cloud floated in front of the little fellow's eyes. She pulled off a piece and held it high in her hand. She looked at her father and asked, "Papa, is this a cloud?" "Yes, try it. Is it delicious?" Hearing this, the little fellow immediately took the white cloud and took a bite. The sweet taste immediately made her smile until her eyes narrowed. Delicious. Papa, eat it. Nian is so obedient. Delicious. The father and daughter ate the cloud. Suddenly, she woke up from the dream. The light was a little dazzling. The little fellow closed her eyes tightly and moaned for a long time before she finally opened her eyes. Nian, you're awake? A woman's voice came into her ears. The little fellow sat up with the help of the woman, with a confused expression on her face. She rubbed her eyes and glanced at the woman. Then, she suddenly burst into tears with a wah. Papa! Papa! Qin Ruoying was stunned. Seeing this, Chen Shi immediately walked over from the side. He gently hugged the little fellow in his arms and kept comforting her. Daddy is here, Daddy is here. Hearing that familiar voice, the little fellow slowly stopped crying. She pouted and hugged Chen Shi tightly. It was as if he had been greatly wronged. After comforting her for a while, Chen Shi saw that she was no longer crying. He picked her up and said with a smile, "Let's go. Daddy will take you to wash your face." The little fellow lay on top of Chen Shi, staring blankly at Qin Ruoying with red eyes. Qin Ruoying was also looking at her. However, the expression on Qin Ruoying's face was very sad. When she saw Chen Shi pick up the little fellow from the bed, she immediately stood up from the chair and walked to the side to make way for Chen Shi. When Chen Shi saw her sad expression, he immediately reached out and patted her arm. While looking for the remote control, she secretly wiped the tears off her face. Qin Ruoying pretended to look for the remote control. The little fellow waited for a while and seemed to be a little impatient, so she lay on the bed and looked for it herself. Sure enough, the remote control was lying quietly on the bedside table. She picked up the remote control and immediately giggled. Here it is. Here it is. As she spoke, she skillfully pressed the button to turn on the TV. The channel was a children's channel, and it was playing her favorite cartoon. So she immediately turned to the other corner of the room and shouted, Big cat! Big cat! Come on, let's watch the cartoon. She didn't know where the big cat was hiding just now, but after hearing the little fellow's call, it immediately came out, turned into a black shadow, and drilled into the little fellow's arms, and obediently watched the cartoon with her. Qin Ruoying turned around and looked at her daughter who was holding the remote control, and holding the big cat in her arms. For a moment, she didn't know what to do. The little fellow waited for a while. Seeing that she was still in a daze, she immediately shouted to her, Mommy! Sit here. As she spoke, she patted the quilt beside her. Qin Ruoying sat on the edge of the bed, but the little fellow seemed to be a little dissatisfied, so she immediately pouted and said, Mommy wants to sit here. Hearing that, Qin Ruoying immediately took off her shoes and sat beside the little fellow. After seeing that she sat down, the little fellow nodded in satisfaction, then directly raised her arm and drilled into her arms like a cat. Mommy, watch the cartoon with me. Okay, Mommy will watch it with you. Outside the house. After hearing the conversation between the mother and daughter, Chen Shi couldn't help but smile slightly. After laughing for a while, he felt relieved and walked to the kitchen. Chapter 115. The courtyard of the Qin family suddenly became lively. There were not many dishes at home, so Chen Shi went to the supermarket first, and then went straight to the kitchen with bags of food. In this family, only he and Nian were outsiders. It was also because of these two outsiders that the atmosphere in the house became a little strange. Qin Ruoying and the little fellow were watching cartoons in the west wing. Qin Xueqing was making a phone call in the east wing, and Qin Yongyan was alone in the study next to the main room, doing something unknown. There were more people at home, so the dinner naturally had to be more sumptuous. So when Chen Shi returned to the kitchen, he started 3 stoves at the same time. He washed and prepared the vegetables, shredded and peeled them, and cooked the soup and stir-fried the vegetables. He was very busy. After all, he did not have 3 heads and 6 arms, so he simply used the sword controlling technique and the fire controlling technique, preparing to cook this family banquet with the means of immortal cultivators. Yes, family banquet. Chun-Shi was brought up by his grandfather since he was a child. Unfortunately, his grandfather died early, so he had no relatives in this world for a long time. When he was in college, he finally had a lover. It also made him understand what it meant to care. Now his lover became his family. Therefore, her family had become his family. He had a family. It was a kind of relationship that was not related by blood, but was comparable to blood. A person who had no family suddenly had a family. So he cherished it more than anyone else. Spiced goose platter, stewed bird's nest with rock sugar, small bowl of golden hook fin, steamed lobster, braised eel, dragon tongue, abalone with snail meat, liaoning ginseng with sauce, steamed crab, steamed eastern star spot, caterpillar fungus stewed with flour glue, 10 dishes, all of which were main dishes. Ying liked to drink vegetable soup, so Chun-Shi specially made a nourishing vegetable soup for her in winter. Chun-Shi scooped up a spoonful with an iron spoon and tasted it. Well, it tasted good. As for the little fellow, she was not picky. As long as it was made by her father, she liked to eat it, so it was easier to clean up. Because he didn't know what his father-in-law and sister-in-law liked, Chun-Shi couldn't cook a dish for them for the time being. Because it was winter, before 6 o'clock in the evening, the sky of Shangjing was completely covered by the curtain of night. Tens of thousands of lanterns lit up the sky without night, 10 li of beautiful gauze filled with fragrance. The lights in the Qin family's courtyard were also turned on. There were many dishes today, so they could only eat in the main hall. After placing the bowls and chopsticks in order, Chun-Shi shouted towards the door, "The food is ready. Come and eat first." The little girl heard her father's shouts. Therefore, she immediately jumped out of Qin Ruoying's arms and stood on the bed, jumping up and down as she said smugly, "Mama, it's time to eat. I'm hungry. I want to eat." "Okay, let's go. Mommy will take you to eat." Qin Ruoying carried the little fellow out of the west wing. When he arrived at the main hall, he was immediately shocked by the sumptuous dinner in front of him. "You did it." She put down the little fellow, then pointed at the big meal in front of her, and couldn't help but ask suspiciously. Chun-Shi used to cook, but he only knew how to cook a few simple home-cooked dishes. He didn't even think about complicated dishes. Take the table in front of her as an example. Even if Chun-Shi told her that he bought it outside, she would probably believe him immediately. "How is it? Is my cooking okay? You've improved." Qin Ruoying quietly glanced at the little fellow. Seeing that she was only focused on the dishes on the table, she quickly kissed Chun-Shi on the face. Being rewarded by his wife, Chun-Shi immediately smiled proudly. He didn't put in so much effort in vain. It was okay. Although they hadn't seen each other for a long time, the tacit understanding between them had become even closer. The two of them stood in front of the main hall and waited for a while. Seeing that the little fellow was a little impatient, they made a move almost at the same time. Without any prior discussion, Qin Ruoying pointed to the study on the right, and Chun-Shi pointed to the east wing on the left. Seeing this, Qin Ruoying immediately smiled and said, "Telepathy." Chun-Shi said, "Telepathy." After that, both of them couldn't help laughing. Qin Ruoying turned and walked to the study. "I'll call Dad first." After she left, Chun-Shi touched the little fellow's head and said, "Nian Nian, good girl. Don't steal food. Dad will call Auntie to eat. We'll eat when Grandpa and Auntie arrive." "Okay. I won't steal food." The little fellow nodded heavily while chewing the spiced goose. "Naughty." Chun-Shi gently pinched her little face, which was bulging like a hamster, and walked out of the main hall with a smile. The light in the east wing was on. Qin Xueqing had been hiding in the room since she came home. No one knew what she was doing. Chun-Shi knocked on the door, but she didn't respond. He couldn't just barge into his sister-in-law's room. Therefore, Chun-Shi waited outside for a while and shouted outside the door, "It's time to eat." He didn't call her that, because he really hadn't thought about how to call his sister-in-law. If he called her by her full name, it would seem too distant. If he called her by her name, with his current relationship with his sister-in-law, he was afraid that he would be slapped in the face. Therefore, Chun-Shi thought about it, and simply didn't even call her by her name. After waiting for a while, the door opened. Qin Xueqing walked out of the east wing, and stood in front of Chun-Shi. She looked at Chunshi thoughtfully, but still didn't say a word. Seeing this, Chunshi smiled and said to her, "It's time to eat." After that, he turned and walked to the main hall. He had already said what he wanted. It was up to her whether she wanted to eat or not. Looking at Chunshi's back, Qin Xueqing hesitated for a moment, then suddenly said, "The leader wants to see you. He hopes that you can come with me to the headquarters in Shangjing." Chunshi didn't turn around, as if he didn't hear her. Qin Xueqing was a little anxious and immediately wanted to chase after him. But at this moment, Chunshi suddenly stopped in his tracks. He leaned to the side and glanced back at Qin Wanqing. Then he said coolly, "I can give you face and let him see me." After that, he turned and walked into the main hall. Outside the study, Qin Ruoying gently knocked on the door. After waiting for 2 seconds, she didn't hear any response, so she pushed the door open and went in. "Dad, it's time to eat." Qin Yongyan sat in the chair and stared at the desk in front of him. No one knew what he was thinking. Qin Ruoying walked to his side. After glancing at the rice paper on the table, she read out the words he wrote on the paper. "The heavenly gate is broken and the Chu River is opened. The blue water flows back to the east. The green mountains on both sides of the river face each other. The lonely sail comes from the horizon." The words were good, and the poem was good. After reading, Qin Ruoying gently put her hand on her father's shoulder. After a little hesitation, she asked uncertainly, "Dad, are you blaming me?" Qin Yongyan didn't say anything. Qin Ruoying stood behind him silently. The expression on her face became more and more sad. Suddenly, Qin Yongyan let out a deep sigh. Then he crumpled the rice paper on the table into a ball and threw it into the wastebasket next to him. Chapter 116. Family Banquet. Family and Banquet. The whole family sat together to eat. This was called a family banquet. Family banquets were so ordinary that there was nothing special about them. They just needed the whole family to sit together and have a happy meal. Huaxia was very big, so customs may be a little different from place to place. In some places, even the most high-end and expensive restaurant could not be regarded as the highest standard for receiving guests. The real highest standard was to invite the guest to the house for a seemingly ordinary home-cooked meal. Family banquet. Chunshi had never eaten a family banquet. The one he had eaten with Yingying before was called a couple's meal. Chunshi returned to the main hall and saw the little fellow standing on the chair, quietly eating the dishes on the table. She knew how to use chopsticks, but she didn't like to use them. Usually, she ate rice and soup, so she usually used a spoon. Chunshi served the main dish today. The little fellow tried a few times and found that she couldn't pick up the dishes, so she simply threw down the chopsticks and grabbed the dishes with her hands. Chunshi quietly walked not far from her and coughed softly. Because he was afraid of scaring her, Chunshi deliberately lowered his voice. But he didn't expect that such a small voice would startle the little fellow. She immediately threw away the braised goose slice in her hand in a panic. "Papa, I didn't steal it." As she spoke, the little fellow quickly wiped the oil on her mouth. Seeing that her hands and mouth were full of oil, Chunshi sat beside her, then took out a tissue and helped her wipe it carefully. As if afraid that her father would be angry, the little fellow immediately pouted and put on a pitiful look. Seeing this, Chunshi rubbed her head and said with a smile, "Good girl, eat when you're hungry. It's okay." As he spoke, Chunshi stood up and handed her the braised goose leg on the table. The little fellow was a little clever. She knew not to take the biggest and most conspicuous braised goose leg, but only some seemingly inconspicuous braised goose slices. "Papa is so nice." After receiving the braised goose leg, the little fellow was immediately overjoyed. She smiled so widely that flowers were about to bloom on her little face. After taking a big bite, she handed the braised goose back to Big Cat while chewing. She said with a lisp, "Big Cat, come you eat too." Hearing this, the big cat quickly jumped to the little guy's side. After taking a bite, it started to meow. This fellow was a monster that had cultivated successfully, and the spiritual chi of heaven and earth had already washed away the filth on its body, so Chunshi didn't mind the little fellow eating with it. Chunshi waited for a moment. Seeing that she was happy, he pulled her to his side and looked into her eyes. he said seriously. Nian, promise me that you won't lie anymore. You can tell me whatever you want. As long as it's reasonable, I'll agree to it. Do you understand? The little guy was stunned for a moment. After hesitating for a moment, she nodded gently and replied weakly with a pout. Okay, I won't lie. Good girl. Chunxi pinched her little face. At this time, Qin Xueqing also walked into the main hall. After seeing her sit down, Chunxi turned his head and looked in the direction of the study. To be honest, he still hadn't decided what kind of attitude he should use to face Qin Yongyan. Since ancient times, the relationship between father and son-in-law was slightly better than the relationship between mother and daughter-in-law. But this didn't mean that there wouldn't be conflicts between father and son-in-law. As the saying goes, the more a mother-in-law looks at her son-in-law, the more she likes him. However, there was no uniform way for a father-in-law to look at his son-in-law. Perhaps it was because mature men were more reserved, so they would hide some of their thoughts in their hearts and wouldn't make a conclusion easily. Even if they liked or disliked him, the father-in-law wouldn't easily express it. Before arriving home, Qin Ruoying proposed to eat outside, but Chunxi said that he wanted to let her try his cooking. Qin Ruoying couldn't persuade him, so there was this sumptuous meal in front of her. In fact, eating wasn't the main point. Meeting Yingying's father officially was the main point of this dinner. Chunxi and Qin Yongyan, this father-in-law and son-in-law, had a very subtle relationship. Nianyan was already 4 years old when Qin Yongyan just found out that he had a granddaughter. And as his son-in-law, Chunxi showed his invincible power in the village in the morning, showing his absolute power that was beyond imagination. Everything that happened. What kind of experience would Qin Yongyan have? Chunxi couldn't imagine it from his perspective. After all, he wasn't involved. Anyway, what's done is done, and he had finished eating. His father-in-law couldn't possibly ask him to spit it out, right? After waiting for a while, Qin Ruoying and Qin Yongyan arrived. As soon as they walked into the main hall, Chunxi was about to get up and greet them. Like Qin Xueqing, Chunxi still hadn't figured out how to address Qin Yongyan. Yingying wasn't his legal wife after all. They were already engaged, so it wouldn't be good to call him dad directly. Nianyan was already 4 years old, and she was still calling him grandpa sweetly. But he was calling Qin Yongyan uncle. Wouldn't that seem too distant? How should he address him? It was so annoying. Even an immortal would worry about such trivial matters. While Chunxi was still worrying, Qin Yongyan's reaction immediately eased Chunxi's awkwardness. Qin Yongyan followed Qin Ruoying into the main hall. Seeing that Chunxi was about to get up, he immediately stopped Chunxi, and then said with a smile, "You've worked hard. Sit down." After that, he directly sat down at the head of the table in front of the red sandalwood carving table. After waiting for so long, the children must be hungry. Let's have a taste. Is the master's cooking as good as his swordsmanship? Qin Yongyan said with a smile, but quietly made a small joke with Chunxi. As soon as he said that, Qin Xueqing's hand, which was about to pick up the chopsticks, suddenly trembled. She was a Wu Dao guru, but now even holding a pair of chopsticks was trembling. It was easy to imagine how complicated her feelings were right now. After all, she wasn't as shrewd and calm as Qin Yongyan. After secretly glancing at Chunxi, she picked up the chopsticks and directly started to eat. At this time, Chunxi got up and pushed the small bowl of golden wings to Qin Yongyan, and then said with a smile, "Sorry to make a fool of myself. This small bowl of golden wings is my specialty. Would you like to have a taste?" "Haha. Then I won't stand on ceremony. Please." A seemingly ordinary family feast began amidst this harmonious atmosphere. During the banquet, Qin Yongyan kept chatting with Chunxi about various trivial matters. Qin Ruoying was responsible for serving the little girl. Only Qin Xueqing was restless and felt very awkward. After finishing the rice quickly, she immediately got up and said, "I'm full. Uncle, sister, take your time." After that, Qin Xueqing turned to leave. However, at this time, Qin Yongyan suddenly stopped her and asked with a smile, "Xueqing, did you talk to your father on the phone?" Qin Xueqing nodded and replied, "Yes, they will come back after a while." "Oh, okay." Qin Yongyan nodded, but then suddenly pointed to her seat and said with a smile, "There are guests at home. You can be considered as half the host here. Don't be in a hurry to leave. Sit down for a while." Ah. Qin Xueqing looked at Qin Yongyan with a little surprise. Seeing that he was looking at her with a smile, Qin Xueqing couldn't help but hesitate for a moment, and then reluctantly sat down again. Chunxi glanced at Qin Xueqing. After seeing her sit down, he suddenly said to Qin Yongyan, "Uncle Qin, sorry for calling you like this." Hearing this, Qin Yongyan immediately turned to look at Chunxi. He still had a smile on his face. He just looked at Chunxi with a smile, and didn't say anything. Seeing this, Chunxi also smiled. He gently held Qin Ruoying's hand under the table, and then said with a smile, "Nian Nian is already 4 years old, but I still owe Yingying a romantic wedding. So I hope to hold this wedding for her under your witness. What do you think? Can you?" Before Qin Yongyan could answer, Qin Ruoying had already turned her head and looked at Chunxi in a daze. Wedding? She really never thought about it. Chunxi had actually been keeping this matter in her heart. Drinking wine and growing old together. Chapter 118. After the couple spent some time together, the date of the wedding was finally set. December 12th. Half a month later. There was no special meaning to it. Chunxi just wanted to do it as soon as possible, so he chose December 12th after thinking about it. 12-12-122. I want to love, I want to love. It felt good and auspicious, so let's do it on that day. Qin Ruoying gave it some thought, and let him make the decision. In fact, she didn't have any special ideas, thinking that it just needed to be simple. As long as she could marry Chunxi under the witness of her father, she would have no regrets in this life. However, Chunxi also wanted to hold a romantic wedding for Yingying, because he had experienced Fong Lei's high-end cruise wedding. Qin Ruoying didn't agree. Not to mention that Chunxi was all alone. Even she didn't have many relatives or friends. So even if the wedding was grand, how many guests could they invite to attend the ceremony? It was a make-up wedding anyway, so it was fine to just give her a simple blessing. Chunxi agreed with her with a smile. The next day, when the little girl woke up, the sun was already high in the sky. Chunxi leaned against the bed and looked at her with a smile. The little girl didn't seem to be awake yet. She stretched, squinted at her father next to her, and then rolled on the bed directly into Chunxi's arms to continue to sleep. The couple sat side by side on the bed, quietly looking at the little girl who was sleeping in Chunxi's arms. Suddenly, they looked at each other again. Then they both laughed. Maybe this was the happiest thing in the world. These 2 days, there would be light snow from time to time. It wasn't heavy, but it was enough to make the snow pile on the ground higher and higher. The weather was good today. After the snow at night, it was sunny during the day. Qin Xueqing might feel that it was not good to eat Chunxi's food for free every day. So when Chunxi went to the kitchen, he found that she had already bought breakfast and put it in the thermal cabinet. His sister-in-law was actually a very domineering person. However, her brother-in-law was stronger than her. She was so domineering that she could no longer raise her head in front of Chunxi. Because the little fellow had gone back to sleep, it was already 9 o'clock in the morning by the time Qin Ruoying took her to wash up and get up for breakfast. Her sister-in-law was a very particular person, so the breakfast she bought was naturally not the porridge and steamed buns from the roadside stalls. He didn't know where she bought these Cantonese morning snacks, but just looking at them was enough to whet his appetite. Because they woke up too late, Qin Xueqing and Qin Yongyan had already eaten. So Chunxi directly took the breakfast back to the West Wing. The little girl liked barbecued pork buns and shrimps very much.